If you are lying down, let the pillow meet the curve of your head, and let the sheet glide over your shoulder, because tonight we will move slowly, almost imperceptibly, from the quiet of your room into a quiet much older than your own. An ancient quiet that once pooled in courtyards before dawn, in barracks at the edge of deserts, in palaces whose doorways framed the rising sun. And if you drift away while we talk, if the words loosen and fall back like tide water, and you begin to float, that is perfectly fine, because this journey is designed to carry you without effort, to offer detail without urgency, to suggest patterns without insisting that you follow them, so that the past becomes a soft landscape where you may stroll or rest or pause wherever you choose. A landscape of stone and sand and watered gardens stitched together by roads that felt the steady press of sandaled feet. Imagine, if it helps, the small sounds near you fading into a neutral hush, the faint hum of a distant appliance, the occasional sigh of plumbing in the walls, the whisper of air moving through a vent, and then imagine those same textures of sound translated into another register, the leather creak of a strap being tightened before dawn, the brush of linen against skin, the muted click of a bronze fitting, the almost inaudible puff of a small brazier as a coal is urged back to life. We are going to the Achaemenid Persian world, and we will go there without rush, because the empire itself moved with a rhythm that rewarded patience, a rhythm of seasons and taxes and the measured hoofbeat of couriers on the royal road, a rhythm that gathered far-off territories into a single administrative breath and let that breath out again across mountains, plateaus, and seas, to sense its scale. Picture, in your mind's eye, a map whose edges are not sharp but hazy with heat, a sweep that begins near the green banks of the Indus and swings westward through irrigated fields and salt-white deserts to the stony shores of the Aegean, and then northward into plains where winter writes in frost and ice, and southward into palm-lined oases where date clusters hang like small suns, and in all these places, caravans move and scribes measure and farmers lift water in repeating arcs, while governors and satraps mark accounts in careful columns, and the empire does not roar so much as breathe a vast, steady exhale and inhale, conducted by treaties and grain stores and the discipline of armies. You might imagine the air there too, because the air will keep you grounded. Dry air that carries the faint, mineral scent of powdered stone. Cool air along riverbanks that smells of damp earth, trailed by the sweetness of crushed reeds. Thin air at high passes, where your breath becomes conscious of itself and each inhalation has to be invited. And now, in this soft mental map, let a road appear, level and durable, the kind of road that gives up no drama but instead offers exactly what a traveler needs: a dependable surface, milestones, relay stations, spaced in measured intervals where a tired messenger can change horses and press on. And along that road, at some point late in the night or early in the morning, depending on how you prefer to name the hour, a column of men begins to form, quiet, orderly, and practiced. Soldiers whose title suggests they cannot diminish. Soldiers the Greeks would call athenotoi, the Immortals, not because they are untouched by time, but because their number is kept constant, 10,000 in name and practice, so that if one man falls away, another steps into the line, and the line, viewed from a distance or at a diplomatic audience, appears unbroken. We will walk beside them for a little while tonight, but we will do it gently, paying attention to the modest details of living rather than the loud moments of dying, because even in an imperial army most hours are not spent in battle, but in routines that repeat until they become a kind of second skin. And routines, as you know from your own life, are soothing to observe when you are tired. The same motions in the same order, the same objects held and put down, the same responsibilities met with the same quiet competence. Before we reach them, though, and before we shift to the figure who gave them work worthy of their name, Cyrus the Great, and before we wander the ceremonial terraces of Persepolis where shadows once pooled at the bases of tall columns, and before we sit, without appetite's urgency, at the great King's table to notice the choreography of attendants and the reflective surfaces of hammered gold, it helps to let the empire's scale settle over you like a white, light blanket, because scale is calming when it is taken slowly. The agricultural basins where barley ripens under a mild winter sun, the mountains where snows persist even in early summer, the caravanserais where animals rest and the smell of grain dust lingers, the ports where cedar and lapis and carved ivory pass from hand to hand with the quiet certainty of scheduled trade. It helps too to remember that empires are administrative, machines made of people whose days resemble ours more than the legend suggests, which means our story will not lean into shock or spectacle, but into the touch points that any person would recognize. The discipline of waking to an obligation, the small comforts of food after effort, the way groups form their own customs that make the world predictable, and the way titles, like Immortal, mean one thing in poetry and another in practice, and in that gap there is often a human story worth telling slowly. So we will proceed in 4 unhurried movements, each one a way of approaching the same world from a slightly different angle, each one expanding the picture without breaking the serenity we are trying to sustain, each one carefully avoiding the jagged edges of gore or panic, because the purpose here is rest and understanding together. First, we will be within the ranks, feeling the weight of the spear, the fit of a soft cap over the brow, the press of scale or quilted armor on shoulders, and the way heat accumulates in fabric by noon. Next, we will walk the early roads of Cyrus, not as a saga of triumphs, but as an itinerary of decisions, geography, and timing, the gentle mechanics of statecraft that reoriented frontiers. Then, we will drift through Persian, not as tourists with cameras, but as patient observers of stone that remembers hands and chisels and ceremonies, noting the coolness of shaded thresholds and the satisfying proportion of stairways designed for deliberate processions. And finally, we will take the quietest seat at a royal banquet, more interested in protocol than in flavors, listening to the subdued clink of vessels and the murmured formulae of greeting as if they were part of a steady song. This is a long path, but not a steep one, and if you slide into sleep halfway through the first turn and wake hours later, that is welcome, because history, when told with humility, keeps watch for you. For now, let the scene narrow to a camp at the edge of dawn, a place where stars are thinning and a distant ridge is beginning to sketch itself against a paling sky, and let the thought settle that the men called Immortals were human in exactly the ways that matter. They woke before they wished to. They managed discomfort with practice. They took pride in standing well when standing was required, and they found in repetition not boredom but a rhythm that made difficult terrain feel navigable. And as you breathe in and out, perhaps a little more slowly now, we will step close enough to hear that rhythm without startling it, and see, with no urgency at all, what it felt like to belong to an unbroken line. In the hour before the first light breaks cleanly over the line of the horizon, when the camp is still cradled in that gray interval between night and day, you begin to rise, not with any suddenness, but with the slow sequence of motions that have become as much a part of you as breath. You are lying on your mat, its reeds pressed into gentle ridges against your hip and shoulder, each one a reminder of how your body shaped itself to the ground during the night. And as you shift, there is the soft crackle of dried fibers adjusting under your weight. The air is cool but not cold, with a thin sharpness that tells you the day ahead will warm quickly, and there is a faint scent in it, wood smoke long dispersed, dry dust unsettled by the breeze, and the mineral temps of water stored in skins nearby. Your cloak, which through the night doubled as your blanket, is gathered around you, and as you draw it back, a thin veil of sand slips from its folds, settling silently onto the earth, grains catching the last of the starlight before vanishing into the same dust that coats the camp. You fold the cloak without thinking, the cloth falling obediently into the creases set by weeks of repetition, and you smooth it with the flat of your palm, feeling the slight variation where patches have been sewn, the stitching neat but uneven in age, some threads newer and brighter, others faded and worn. Nearby you hear the shuffle of another man rising, the hollow thud of feet finding sandals, the small exhale of air as a stiff back straightens. Someone shakes out their bedding in a slow arc, releasing a faint cloud of grit that drifts briefly in the pale air before dissipating. The sound is soft, almost like a sigh, and it settles over the camp with the same unobtrusive presence as the cough that follows from another direction, low, unhurried, and soon quieted. You reach for your tunic, folded and set at your side the night before, its linen softened by long use, but still holding the firmness of its weave, and as you lift it, it releases a dry scent, a mingling of sun-warmed fabric, the faintest trace of the oil used in washing, and a hint of dust from yesterday's march. Pulling it over your head, the cloth slips down your shoulders and falls into place with the practiced ease of something worn countless times, the hem brushing the tops of your knees, the sleeves settling comfortably along your arms. The tunic's texture is familiar to your skin, the weave faintly ridged, catching light in tiny irregularities where the threads have thickened or thinned with wear. Next you reach for the armor-quilted linen reinforced in places, its weight neither oppressive nor light, but insistent, reminding you with every motion of its presence. The first touch of the straps against your forearms is cool, and as you fasten them, the leather edges press briefly before yielding, warming to your body's heat. The buckles close with a muted clink, a sound softened by the fabric that lies between metal and air, and each one is followed by a slight adjustment as you settle the fit. Around you, the quiet choreography of preparation unfolds. A man kneeling to check the tension in the leather binding his sandal, tugging until it lies flat against the curve of his foot. Another running a thumb lightly along the edge of his short sword, not testing it in any dramatic sense, but confirming with a practiced touch that the edge is where it should be. From somewhere to your left, the faint scrape of a knife being drawn across a whetstone reaches your ears, each pull deliberate and even, the sound granular and steady. A small fire is being coaxed from last night's embers, the dull red deepening into orange as a breath is given to it, a thread of smoke curling upward, carrying with it the resinous scent of the wood chosen for its long burn. The camp as a whole remains subdued, each man absorbed in his own sequence of tasks, but together creating a shared rhythm, a layering of tiny sounds, the swish of cloth being pulled straight, the soft knock of a shield set down for a moment, the hollow tap of a water skin being tested for its weight that blend into something less like a collection of noises and more like a single muted hum. You bend to gather your own shield, its oval surface showing the marks of long service scratches dulled to a matte finish, the rim smoothed in places where hand or strap has worn it over years. The leather grip is familiar to your palm, its shape molded subtly by the way you carry it, and as you sling it over your back for the march, the weight distributes itself in a way that your body has learned to accommodate without conscious thought. The spear comes next, its shaft of seasoned wood cool to the touch, its balance exact, the point resting easily in the air before you tilt it to the angle suited for movement. With each piece in place, the sense of readiness is not one of anticipation for some dramatic event, but of returning to a posture that has been yours for so long. It is nearly as natural as standing itself. As you glance around, you see the same readiness mirrored in other small nods exchanged. A strap tightened once more, a final sip from a skin before it is corked and hung. The sun is not yet visible, but the eastern edge of the world has begun to pale. A slow bleeding of color into the gray, and in that light, the figures of your companions are shaped first, then faces, then the small details of their gear. The camp center clears as men move to their assigned places in the column, and you step into your own, the space measured so that each man's movements will not impede the next. There is no signal beyond a quiet word passed down the line, and then the first steps are taken, the ground firm and cool underfoot, carrying you out of the stillness of the camp and into the longer stillness of the march, where each stride will be the echo of the one before, and every sound you hear now the faint chime of gear, the breath of those beside you, the low murmur of an officer's instruction will continue in much the same way until the sun has climbed and fallen again. And as you move forward, the morning you have just lived through, with its dust, its folded cloth, its muted metal, and its shared quiet, becomes simply the opening phrase in the unbroken rhythm of another day in the line of the Immortals. The march begins not with a trumpet or a shouted order, but with the smallest of shifts, a collective exhalation that seems to ripple invisibly along the column, a settling of straps, a brief adjusting of shields, the kind of coordinated movement that requires no signal other than the knowledge of the hour. And then the first steps are taken, measured and deliberate, so that the line, once it begins to flow forward, does so without any sudden breaks. The soundscape is at first a quiet layering of textures, sandals pressing against the compacted earth with a soft, irregular thud, the muted swish of fabric brushing against itself in rhythm with each stride, the faint but distinct creak of leather harnesses as weight shifts across the shoulders and chest, metal fittings answering occasionally with a subdued clink, and from somewhere in the middle of the column, the gentle, almost conversational murmur of two voices exchanging a few words before falling silent again, their conversation absorbed into the warm body of the march. Overhead the sky is a pale, washed-out blue that will deepen with the day, the early light filtering sideways, catching on the spear points so that they flash and then fade in time with the men's movements. The road underfoot is familiar to many here, its compacted surface, laid down by hands that have known this work for generations. Edges defined where countless feet have marked the same boundary, the occasional stone pressed flush into the earth so that the surface remains even. The first stretch of the day carries you across open, scrubby plains, the kind where the plants are low and wiry, their leaves narrow and gray-green, adapted to the dryness, and the scent that rises from them when the breeze stirs is faintly resinous, almost sharp. The land is flat enough that you can see far ahead, the line of the column stretching out in a taper, narrowing toward the vanishing point where heat will later draw its shimmering veil. And to either side the ground runs away in gentle swells before flattening again, scattered with patches of pale soil and darker earth where rain has once lingered. As the sun rises higher, the air begins to shift, not yet hot, but warmer in a way that reminds you to drink before thirst sets in, and the straps at your shoulder, warmed by your own body and the growing light, soften slightly, molding themselves more closely to you. The soundscape changes subtly with the temperature sandals lifting and falling on a surface that has lost some of its early stiffness. The creak of leather deepening in tone, the faint metallic chime from a belt ring dampened by the heat-swollen material, and now and then the low call of an officer passing a message backward or forward, the words indistinct by the time they reach your position, their tone enough to convey the meaning. Ahead, the land begins to rise in slow undulations, the kind of hills that seem modest from a distance but reveal their pull in the lengthening of your breath and the small adjustments in your stride. Here the ground grows rocky, the earth a mixture of loose gravel and exposed stone, the sound underfoot sharper. A slight crunch replacing the earlier thud, and the men ahead adjust their pace fractionally so that the column remains even. The air shifts again as you climb, growing cooler with the gain in height, and the breeze that comes down from the higher ground carries with it a different scent, one less of resin and more of mineral, as though the rocks themselves breathe faintly in the shade. From the crest, the road falls away again, and you begin the long descent toward a lower plain. The view opening in slow degrees to reveal a patchwork of color-paler sands near the ridges, deeper browns, where the ground dips and collects more moisture, occasional flashes of green where some plant has found a pocket of deeper soil. The pace on the downward slope is careful, the sound of shifting gravel louder now, the occasional skitter of a stone knocked loose and rolling a short distance before coming to rest. In the distance, as the land flattens again, you see a darker smudge that resolves itself into a stand of palms, their fronds lifting and settling in a rhythm set by the breeze, and as you draw nearer the smell reaches you first, damp earth, not the sharp mineral of the high ground, but a deeper, cooler scent that rises from soil long accustomed to holding water. The oasis is not large, but two eyes and bodies that have been measuring distance by the heat of the ground. It feels abundant, a gift wrapped in shadow and sound. The column's order holds as you approach, men peeling away in small groups to kneel beside the water, their movements unhurried but with a purpose that needs no explanation. The surface of the pool is still in places lightly riffled and others where a breeze moves across it. And when you bend to drink, the first touch of the water to your lips is shockingly cool, almost startling after the steady rise of the day's warmth. And then as you swallow, the sensation spreads inward, easing the dryness in your mouth, softening the rasp at the back of your throat. You feel your skin, watching the bubbles rise lazily to the surface, the smell of the water mingling with the scent of nearby vegetation. The greener, almost sweet in comparison to the plains. Someone nearby dips a cloth into the pool and wrings it out over the back of his neck, the water running in quicksilver lines down his skin before vanishing into the dust at his feet, leaving behind only a darker patch that will fade in minutes. The sound here is different from the marcia soft lapping where water meets the edges. The low hum of bees moving between the small blossoms hidden among the palms, the faint rustle of fronds moving overhead, all of it layered over the quieter breathing of men who, for this brief moment, are still. You drink again, slower this time, letting the water rest against your tongue before swallowing, and then you stand, adjusting your gear, feeling the straps settle once more into the familiar places, the shield's weight returning to your back, the spear finding its balance in your hand. As the column reforms, the movement is without haste, but with the inevitability of habit, men stepping back into the measured spaces that will carry them forward. The soundscape returning, feet against earth, leather creaking, the occasional clink of metal as the oasis falls behind and the road stretches once more into the distance, the landscape shifting again, and you with it, part of a slow, steady current that moves as much through time as through space. When the day's march draws to a close and the column has settled into the quiet work of making camp, the preparation of food begins not with the flourish of a banquet, but with the careful, repetitive gestures that have fed soldiers across this land for generations, gestures so ingrained that they seem to belong as much to the body as to the mind. This is not food made to impress, nor food made to linger over, but food made to sustain, simple food, eaten in the same way, day after day. The familiarity of its taste and texture offering a kind of comfort in its very predictability. The flatbread comes first, as it always does, its preparation begun almost as soon as the camp settles, because the dough needs time to rest before it can be cooked. Flour is brought out from tightly sealed sacks, the fine powder released into the evening air in a faint cloud that carries with it the dry, clean scent of grain, a scent that seems to steady the space around it. Water drawn carefully from skins or nearby sources is added in small deliberate measures, the two elements meeting in the shallow bowl or on the flat stone used for mixing. Hands move slowly at first, working the water into the flour, gathering the loose edges into the center, folding and pressing, until the mixture forms something cohesive, something that can be shaped. The texture changes beneath the palms from the dry shifting slip of flour to a tacky resistance to a smooth pliant surface that yields slightly to the push of fingers and the heel of the hand. Salt is added sparingly, more for the way it steadies the dough than for the taste it will leave. And sometimes, when the supplies allow, a trace of oil is worked in, giving the dough a softer feel and a slightly richer scent. Once the dough is ready, it is divided into portions, each rolled into a small ball and then pressed out flat with the slow, even pressure of a palm or the smooth curve of a small rolling pin, the surface dusted with just enough flour to keep it from clinging. These thin circles are set aside, covered loosely with cloth to keep the evening air from drying them before they meet the heat. Nearby a fire has been coaxed into a low, steady burn, the coals beneath glowing with a heat that can be felt on the skin even from a short distance, and over this a flat griddle or stone is placed, already warming, its surface darkened by the many meals it has carried. Each circle of dough is laid upon it, the contact producing a faint hiss and a changing color as the heat begins to travel upward the surface of the bread, tightening small bubbles forming as the moisture inside seeks escape. The smell rises almost immediately, warm, nutty, and carrying with it the suggestion of hearths far from here, of kitchens where this same simple food, eaten in the same way day after day, is made for those who will not march tomorrow. The bread is turned once, the second side browning in patches, the edges lifting slightly as if in a slow exhale, and when it is done, it is set aside, wrapped in cloth to keep its heat, joined by the others until there is enough to share. Alongside the bread, other provisions are prepared. The dried meat, which in its current state is stiff, fibrous and unyielding, is taken in hand and broken into smaller pieces, each piece dropped into a pot or bowl of water, where it will soak and soften, the water gradually darkening as it takes on the flavor of the meat. Sometimes the liquid is heated, steam rising in thin ribbons, the warmth hastening the transformation, and in the process, a smell emerges savory, faintly smoky, with a saltiness that speaks of preservation rather than freshness. The meat, once softened, is chewed slowly, the fibers giving way reluctantly at first, then more readily as they release their stored richness, and while it is not tender in the way of a feast, it satisfies in another way entirely. It is steady, dependable, the kind of nourishment you can count on, just as you can count on the march to begin again tomorrow. After bread and meat, there is one more element, often saved for last, the small luxury of dates. They are not a daily ration, but when they are available, they are a quiet gift, their dark, wrinkled skins concealing a sweetness that is almost startling after the plainness of the other food. One is taken in hand, its surface slightly tacky, the shape yielding easily between the fingers, and as you bite into it, the dense flesh gives way to a deep, almost caramel flavor, the sweetness mingling with the lingering salt and grain of the earlier meal. It is a contrast that sharpens the senses for a moment before allowing them to relax again. These dates are shared in small handfuls passed from one to another, sometimes with a word, sometimes with only a glance, and there is an unspoken understanding that such things are best savored quietly. The meal from start to finish unfolds in this unhurried way, each part following the other in the same order. It always does: bread first, then meat, then, if fortune smiles, the dates, simple food, eaten in the same way, day after day, not because there is no other choice, but because in a life where so much depends on movement, there is a deep relief in having something that stays the same. Around the fires men eat without ceremony, the low murmur of voices blending with the occasional crackle from the wood, the light from the flames catching on the curves of shields and the edges of spearheads stacked neatly nearby. When the eating is done, the remains are tidied away, the bread cloth folded, the pot rinsed, the last crumbs brushed from the lap, and there is a stillness that settles over the camp, the kind that comes not from exhaustion alone, but from the quiet satisfaction of a need met, the body knowing that it has been given what it requires to carry on. In this way, the food is more than fuel, it is a thread that ties the days together, marking time in the same dependable sequence, no matter where the road has taken you, and as you lie down later, your stomach warmed by the bread and meat, the sweetness of the dates lingering faintly at the edge of memory, you know that tomorrow will bring the same ritual, the same gestures, the same tastes, and in that sameness, there is something that feels very much like home. You stand at your appointed place in the great palace complex, not because the hour is filled with incident, but precisely because it is not. This stillness is the duty, the lack of motion, the service, and this understanding has become second nature to you, so that the long hours at your post are not endured so much as inhabited. The body settling into a posture that can be held, the mind flowing into a slower current. The spear you hold is no different from the one you carried on the road, but here its weight feels heavier, not because it has grown but because you do not shift it often. The muscles in your arm and shoulder learning to hold without the relief of swinging motion, your grip adjusted now and then by the smallest degree to keep the blood moving. The shield strapped across your back rests solidly, its curve following the line of your spine, its weight like a stone you have agreed to carry pressing just enough to remind you of its presence at all times. You stand upon a floor made not of packed earth or gravel but of stone tiles, each cut and laid with a precision that makes the surface almost seamless. The coolness of the stone rising through your sandals into your feet, a different kind of ground from the one you know on the march, this one deliberate and unchanging. Before you, the walls rise high, their surfaces carved with reliefs that tell stories without words, long processions of figures bearing gifts, animals rendered with such attention that you can trace the muscles along their flanks, scenes of kings seated beneath canopies with attendants, in ordered rows, the lines crisp and shallow, catching the light so that shadows fall into the carved grooves, giving the images a living depth. At certain hours, when the sun moves across the courtyard, the figures seem to shift slightly, not in reality but in the way the contrast changes, a procession becoming more pronounced as the shadow edges sharpen, only to soften again later in the day. The doors you guard are tall, far taller than a man, made of heavy wood clad in metalwork, each panel inlaid with patterns that repeat in careful symmetry. Some shapes geometric, others floral, their surfaces polished so that they take the light and hold it in a muted gleam. The handles thick and worked into shapes that fit the hand in an oddly satisfying way, are not for you to use, how you are to watch, not to enter, yet you know from the movement of others how the doors swing inward with a slow grace, revealing the inner halls to those permitted. Sometimes, the faint sound of voices comes from beyond them, the tone measured, the words indistinct, like water flowing behind a wall. To either side of your post, the colonnade stretches, its columns rising like tree trunks carved from a single piece, their surfaces fluted, their capitals worked into forms of animals, bulls, lions, griffins facing outward in pairs, the stones so finely dressed that your eyes can follow the curve of a line without a break. The roof they support casts a deep shade, and the air there is cooler, the light diffused, lending the space a quiet that feels held in place by the architecture itself. At your feet, the tiled floor extends outward into the courtyard, where the pattern changes subtly here, a border of darker stone, there an inlay of lighter shapes forming a design you have traced with your eyes so many times that you can recall it in detail even when you are away from it. The courtyard beyond is open to the sky, and when the wind shifts, it carries with it scents from the garden cedar cypress, the faint sweetness of flowers you cannot name planted, not for their yield but for their beauty. The hours pass slowly, and in that slowness you notice things others might not. The way the shadow of a column moves across the floor, marking the day in increments, the soft hum of insects that make their home in the shaded spaces, the distant splash of water from a fountain you cannot see from here but have heard so often it feels like part of the building's pulse. Now and then, people pass, scribes carrying tablets, officials in robes that whisper against the floor, servants with trays balanced in steady hands, and each time they draw near the doorway their pace adjusts, their posture changes, as if the gravity of the place draws them into alignment with its order. Some glance at you briefly acknowledging your presence, others do not look at all, knowing you will be there as you always are. You keep your eyes level, your expression neutral, your attention wide enough to take in the movement on either side without turning your head. The discipline is not in resisting motion, but in becoming so still that you feel almost like another carved figure set among the relief. Your breathing the only sign of life to a casual observer. When the sun is high, the heat presses down, but the shade of the colonnade shields you from the worst of it, the air moving in slow eddies, carrying the dry scent of stone warmed by light. Later, as the sun lowers, the light shifts again, striking the reliefs at a new angle, making some details glow while others recede, and you watch without staring, noting the way a carved robe seems to ripple with shadow, the way an animal's eye catches a fragment of light. The weight of your spear becomes more noticeable as the hours stretch, but you adjust it minutely, rolling your grip, shifting your balance from one foot to the other in ways so small that they are invisible to those watching. these micro-movements allowing you to maintain the appearance of complete stillness. Inside, the palace continues its business, decisions made, messages dispatched, meals served, and you remain at your post, a fixed point in a moving world, the threshold between the space within and the space without. There is a kind of satisfaction in this role, not in action but in constancy, in knowing that your presence is part of the palace's own language, a sign to all who see it that the order within is guarded, that the great king's person and household are shielded by men who do not waver. When the change of the watch comes, it is as quiet as the hours you have just passed, to relief stepping into place, your own body stepping away, the spear and shield still with you, but now borne in motion again, the tiled floor giving way to the stones of the outer court, the sound of your sandals on each surface distinct in your memory, another day's vigil complete, ready to be repeated as many times as you are called to stand in the stillness of the palace gates. On campaign, the hardships arrive not in a single overwhelming blow, but as a succession of conditions, each with its own weight, its own texture, each demanding a kind of adaptation that becomes over time second nature to those who live most of their days on the road. In the desert lands, the sun rises quickly and without hesitation, and the light it brings is not the gentle radiance of early morning elsewhere, but a sharp, unfiltered glare that floods the world with a kind of white-gold intensity, making the edges of every stone and ripple of sand stand out in blinding clarity. By mid-morning, the air itself seems to quiver, heat bending the light into mirage pools that shimmer on the horizon and retreat as you approach, the ground underfoot radiating warmth that pushes up through the soles of your sandals, until it feels as though the heat comes from both above and below. In such glare, the eyes narrow instinctively, and the men pull their head coverings forward, linen or wool drawn low over the brow, leaving only a narrow slit through which to watch the path. Cloaks are not only for warmth but for shade, the heavier weave draped over the head and shoulders to create a pocket of cooler air, the ends sometimes wrapped across the lower face to shield the mouth and nose from the fine dust that rides invisibly in the sunlit air. Water becomes a calculation: how much to drink now for relief, how much to save for the next stretch, the weight of the skin both a comfort and a burden. Then, without warning, the sky may change. The light dimming as a veil of windborne dust begins to gather, the edge of a sandstorm announced first by a low, distant hiss that grows steadily louder. The color of the air shifts to a muted ochre haze, and in moments, the horizon disappears, the world reduced to the space of a few paces. Here, the soldiers move quickly into a practiced formation, shields drawn together to form a windbreak, their curved surfaces taking the brunt of the sand's assault. Cloaks are doubled over faces, the fabric pressed close to the skin to filter the air, eyes shielded behind whatever protection is available, slitted cloth, lowered helms while the wind presses relentlessly, filling every fold, every seam, with grit. Speech becomes impossible in the rush of the storm, and so they rely on touch, a hand on the shoulder of the man ahead to keep the line intact, each step taken by feel more than sight. When the storm passes, as suddenly as it began, the air is left heavy, almost still, the ground patterned with ripples where the sand has been rearranged, and everything armor, skin, hair bears the fine dust until it can be shaken or wiped away. If the march carries them into the high plateaus, another set of extremes takes hold. Here, the days can be warm enough to loosen the joints and soften the air, but when the sun drops, the temperature falls sharply, the heat vanishing into the thin, dry atmosphere so quickly that the body shivers before the mind has caught up. The stars above are countless and bright, the sky so clear it feels as if the cold is part of its sharpness, and every sound the crack of a twig in the fire. The shift of a stone underfoot seems louder, carrying farther. The men adapt by building their fires in hollows, where the heat can be trapped and the flames hidden from any unwanted eyes on the surrounding heights. Cloaks are wrapped tightly, doubled if possible, the thickest fabrics saved for the night, hoods drawn close so that breath warms the air inside, fingers kept in motion to preserve sensation. Some use their shields as windbreaks even here, planting them in the earth to cut off the sharpest edge of the mountain gusts, their broad curves redirecting the flow so that the fire burns steadier and the sleepers can huddle with less exposure. In all these conditions, desert glare, sudden sandstorms, plateau cold, the adaptation is not dramatic but methodical, the product of repetition and quiet discipline, knowing when to shift the load on the shoulder to spare a muscle for later, when to stop and adjust a strap before it rubs raw, when to take a small mouthful of water and let it sit before swallowing, when to crouch behind the shield to let the wind pass rather than trying to fight it. The hardships are many, but each has its countermeasure, learned from those who have marched this way before. passed down not as orders but as habits fold, the cloak this way to cover the face without muffling the breath. Anchor the shield like this so the wind will not pull it away. Keep the fire low and the coals banked so they last until morning. And though the body feels the strain, the dryness in the throat after a day under the sun, the grit between teeth after a storm, the ache in the bones from a night spent on frozen ground, there is also the quiet knowledge that endurance comes from these small practiced acts, from the understanding that no single hardship is greater than the steady will to continue to put one foot after the other, to hold the line, to let the extremes pass, and be replaced by the next, until the road leads down into gentler air and the campfire esclow signals a place to rest, if only until the dawn brings its own demands again. The name Immortal rests on your shoulders with a weight that is not the same as your armor, not the same as the spear you hold, not the same as the shield that presses across your back during the long march. It is lighter than all of those in one sense, no physical mass to it at all, and yet heavier in another, because it binds you to an idea that stretches far beyond the measure of your own life. A name that does not promise you personal invulnerability, but promises instead that the line you stand in will never be broken, that the number will always be kept at 10,000, that the world will always see the same unchanging shape, even as the men inside it change with the seasons. In the still moments of camp, or in the long monotony of a march when the sound of footsteps and leather creak becomes almost like breathing, you have time to feel the distinction between the individual and the whole, how your own years are finite, counted by the turns of the sun and the wear in your joints, while the regiment's years are uncounted, stretching backward into memory you cannot personally hold, forward into a future you will not live to see. To be an immortal, in the truest sense of what the name means, is to accept that you are both essential and replaceable, that your presence in the line matters utterly in the moment and not at all in the long reckoning, because the line existed before you stepped into it and will exist after you step out. The title has a ceremonial clarity to outsiders. It suggests a kind of divine preservation, a refusal of time's claims, but for you and those beside you, it is understood as a work of maintenance, a practice in continuity, a ritual of numbers and discipline. When a man falls ill, another is found to stand in his place, not because his life is dismissed, but because the image of the line unbroken is the thing being served, the idea that no enemy, no hardship, no passage of years can diminish the regiment. You have seen this happen without pause. A comrade taken from the march by injury, replaced by the next morning with someone new to the rhythm, his gear adjusted to match his position in the line, indistinguishable from the man who held it yesterday. In this way, the name Immortal is like the surface of a river, always the same to those who look at it from the bank, even though the water that forms it is always moving, always replaced. Your own life, by contrast, feels more like a single clay vessel once shaped. It holds its form for a while, useful and solid, but if it breaks, it is gone, its fragments no longer part of the original pattern. You do not resent this truth. In fact, there is a certain peace in it, because it releases you from the burden of thinking that the regiment's fate rests on you alone, and it binds you to something larger than yourself, without requiring that you control it. The line's immortality is made of countless mortal spans, joined end to end, each link indistinguishable from the next when viewed from afar, but each carrying its own quiet story of days marched, of food shared, of hardships endured. You know that your body will age, that the road will one day take more from you than you can give back, that the gear you now wear will be passed to another whose steps are surer, whose breath comes easier. When that time comes, the regiment will not falter, it will absorb the change as it has always done. The number restored, the shape preserved, the watchers seeing only the same unbroken front. Some might find this thought disquieting, the idea that the whole is indifferent to the parts, but in the rhythm of military life, it becomes a comfort, a way of locating yourself in a pattern that does not depend on your singular survival. You are one among many, part of a continuity that you contribute to without having to sustain alone, and that continuity in turn sustains you, giving your days a frame, a repetition that steadies even as it changes you. When you stand in the palace on ceremonial guard, or when you march along the dusty road toward the next garrison, the same truth applies. You are not the beginning of the line, and you will not be its end, but you are the line for as long as you are in it, and that is enough. Perhaps this is the deeper meaning of the name, less about the fantasy of never dying, more about the discipline of never letting the line die, of accepting that your own finite span is made more meaningful by being woven into an infinite one. In this way, the Immortals are not so different from the empire itself. Rulers come and go, satraps are appointed and replaced, cities rise and fall, but the structure holds, the administration continues. The roads are maintained, the tribute collected, the messages sent, the image of the great king upheld. You live inside that same cycle, a human reflection of an imperial principle, and in that reflection there is a lesson about the nature of endurance, not that nothing changes, but that change is managed so carefully that it is invisible to those who only glance, and by the time they look again, what is altered has already been absorbed into the whole. As you consider this, in the quiet stretches between duties, you might think of the men who held your place a generation ago, their names unknown to you, their faces gone, their lives ended in the ordinary ways of soldiers, age, battle, the slow wearing down of the body, and yet their presence persists in the unbroken number, in the reputation carried forward, in the way your own place feels like a continuation rather than a beginning. And you might think of the man who will stand where you stand after you are gone, and the one after him, and the one after that, each stepping into the same invisible current, each believing, as you do now, that the work lies not in being remembered as an individual, but in keeping the whole unbroken for as long as the empire itself endures. In the end, the title Immortal is a kind of poetry, a compact between appearance and reality, between the fragile span of a human life and the larger, sustained illusion of permanence. It tells the world that the King's Guard is beyond the reach of loss, even as every man inside the guard knows that loss is constant, that only the structure is preserved, not the pieces within it. And perhaps there is a strange beauty in that your life can serve a name that outlives you, that your steps can carry forward a line that began before you and will continue after you, that your own mortality becomes, in the eyes of the watching world, part of an immortality that exists only because of the quiet, steady replacement of one mortal with another, the passing of a torch that is never allowed to go out. The day has been long, and its weight sits on every muscle. But the march has ended in a place chosen for its shelter and its access to water, a place where the ground is firm but not so stony that it will rob you of rest, where the wind is broken by a low ridge to the north and a stand of trees to the east, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. The camp takes shape in the same quiet, deliberate sequence it always does, no shouted orders, no frantic activity, just the low hum of practiced motion, each man knowing where to set his gear, where to lay his cloak, where to position himself in relation to his fellows. Fires are kindled not in great blazes, but in modest, steady glows, their light confined and their smoke coaxed to rise straight and thin into the cooling air. The flames, when you glance at them, are more ember than blaze, a deep orange that shifts toward red as the wood burns down, casting a light that makes the edges of armor gleam softly and turns the metal's usual brightness into something muted, almost warm. The shields are stacked carefully near their owners, some propped upright against packs, others laid flat, their curves catching the faintest trace of the firelight, while spears are set in ordered rows, their tips angled away from the bodies resting nearby, the line of them neat enough to satisfy even the most particular eye. Armor is unfastened and lifted away, set on folded cloth to keep it from resting directly on the ground, the pieces arranged in the order they will be put on again in the morning, so that there will be no hesitation, no searching for a misplaced strap or buckle when the time comes. The sounds of the camp are small and close now, the quiet tearing of bread, the muted splash of water poured from a skin into a shallow vessel, the murmur of a voice speaking a few words to a companion before both fall silent, the occasional rustle of fabric as someone shifts on their bedding to find a more comfortable position. Above, the sky deepens from blue to indigo to the dense black of full night, the stars appearing one by one, each taking its place in a pattern that has been there longer than any empire, longer than any road you have marched. The air is cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of the fires, the sharper note of freshly disturbed earth, and somewhere far off, the thin, high call of a night bird that will repeat itself at irregular intervals until you are too far in the drift of sleep to notice. You lie back, feeling the ground solid beneath you, the weight of the day's march settling into your bones, but in a way that is more grounding than exhausting, a kind of earned heaviness that will yield to rest. The light from the nearest fire flickers over your closed eyelids, and even without looking, you can imagine the curve of the men's backs as they bend over their food or adjust their bedding, the glow of the embers pulsing gently as if in rhythm with the slow breathing of the camp itself, the ordered rows of gear standing ready for the morning like silent sentinels. In these moments, when the world has narrowed to the quiet circle of your own place and the few sounds that carry within it, the thoughts that come are often of the larger shape you are part of. The way this camp, this regiment, this entire army fits into the structure of something vast. The Immortals are only one arm of the force, but they are the arm that is always shown, always presented as the proof of the Empire's strength, the unbroken number that others measure themselves against, and the Empire itself stretching from the rivers in the east to the seas in the west, from the mountains in the north to the deserts in the south, does not exist merely by the will of those who march its roads, but by the vision of those who laid its foundations. The line you stand in, the uniform you wear, the roads you travel, the cities you pass through, the coin you are paid, the very idea that there is an order to be kept and a border to be held, all of it owes its shape to those who came before, to the rulers who built not only with stone and mortar, but with policies, alliances, and an understanding of how to bind together lands and peoples who might otherwise have had little in common. As you listen to the soft crackle of the fire, to the faint clink of metal as someone shifts their gear, to the sigh of a man settling into sleep, you find your mind turning to the figure who stands at the start of it all, the one whose name is spoken with respect even now, long after his own life ended, because his work continues in every road, every market, every law, every army, that still moves under the same banner. This army, this empire, owed much to its leaders, and the greatest of them was Cyrus, who built it from the ground up. It is his story, more than any other, that explains why you lie here tonight, in a camp that feels secure, on a road that feels certain, in a regiment that will remain at full strength tomorrow, no matter what the day brings. The firelight wavers, and steadies again, shadows leaning and then drawing back, as if in quiet agreement that to understand the Immortals, one must understand the man who made their existence possible, who imagined not only a throne for himself, but a system that could hold steady under his heirs, a framework into which an army like yours would fit as naturally as a stone fits into the wall it was shaped for. The night deepens, the camp grows more still, and in that stillness the thought takes on a clarity that does not disturb but settles into place. To know where you stand, you must know how this all began. Before the figure of Cyrus steps into the story, the land itself must be allowed to unfold in its own time, for it is in the folds of geography, in the patterns of power, in the small daily habits of people, that the world he inherited truly lives. In the middle of the 6th century before our era, the map of this part of the world was not a single great expanse colored in the same hue, but a patchwork kingdoms and city-states, tribal lands and border regions, each with its own ruler, its own customs, its own ways of reckoning, loyalty and obligation. To the north, the Median Empire stood as the dominant power, a realm of broad plateaus and mountain fortresses, its rulers accustomed to exacting tribute from those around them, a web of alliances and subjugations that bound weaker states to them without necessarily erasing their individuality. To the south lay the land of Persis, dry and rugged in many places, with fertile pockets where rivers cut the earth and allowed barley and wheat to grow. Here, the kingdom of Anshan held sway, ruled by its own line of kings, but living in the long shadow of the Medes, offering tribute and military support when called upon, and in return, allowed to govern its own affairs in the smaller matters of law, harvest, and local dispute. The air in Anshan was marked by contrasts. In summer, the sun drew a pale glaze over the hills, their scrubby vegetation releasing a resinous scent when the wind passed. In winter, rains would sweep in from the west, quickening the grass in the valleys and sending small streams running between stones. The hills themselves were not imposing mountains, but long, rolling ridges, their slopes dotted with juniper and tamarisk, the higher reaches fading into pale rock that caught the light in bands of gold and gray. The villages and towns nestled in these valleys were modest, built from sun-baked brick and stone, their walls washed in pale plaster that flaked gently under the sun, revealing the earth tones beneath. In the markets, shaded by awnings of woven reed or wool, traders spread out their goods on mats grain, in coarse sacks, wool in bundled skeins, jars of oil sealed with clay stoppers, and, on better days, small luxuries brought from farther afield, beads of carnelian worked bronze pins, a handful of dyed cloth in colors richer than the local plants could provide. The air there was always alive with a subdued blend of smells: warm bread from a nearby oven, the faint tang of cured meat, the sharper scent of fresh herbs crushed between fingers as they were weighed for sale, and the unmistakable dry smell of dust stirred by many feet. The people moved at a pace set not by any clock, but by the rhythm of the day, the cooler hours used for labor and trade, the hotter hours for work and shade, and the evenings for gathering. To the north, in the Median cities, the architecture was more imposing, their palaces raised on stone platforms, approached by broad stairways, their columns rising in fluted shafts, capped with carved forms of animals, bulls, lions, composite beasts whose faces looked outward toward the lands they ruled. The walls were often painted in patterns of deep blues and reds, geometric borders framing panels of stylized flowers or the repeating forms of sacred animals. Within, the air was cooler, shaded by the depth of walls and the overhang of roofs supported on timber beams. The floors paved in stone or covered in red matting, the scent of incense clinging to the spaces where courtiers met and where the king held audience. Here, in these halls, the politics of the region were woven, threads of loyalty, marriage, trade, and obligation tangled together into agreements that could last for decades or unravel in a single season. For a vassal kingdom like Anshan, this was the world in which it moved, sending tribute northward in the form of grain, textiles, or soldiers when called for, receiving in return the protection, or at least the acknowledgement, of the Median throne. And yet, beneath the surface, there was always the possibility of change, the knowledge that no order, however solid it appears, is entirely fixed. The land remembered older powers, the Elam, whose cities now lay quiet but whose art and language still left their marks. The people remembered times when the balance between north and south, between plateau and valley, was different. In this layered landscape, a young prince named Cyrus would grow up, his childhood shaped by the scent of sun on stone, by the sight of traders unloading their goods in the market square, by the sound of hoofbeats on the packed earth roads that linked the valleys to the high plains. He would have seen the Median envoys in their fine robes, their belts clasped with worked metal, their speech measured and formal, and he would have known, even as a boy, that his own land's independence was a careful thing, maintained not by equal power but by the quiet art of fitting one's own needs into the spaces allowed by a greater force. This was the stage before the curtain of his life truly rose, a world balanced between the rugged independence of small kingdoms and the overarching reach of an empire, a world of dry hills and fertile valleys, of markets shaded from the sun, of palace walls painted in colors that seemed to hold the heat of the day, of treaties sealed with gifts and promises, a world waiting for someone with a vision to see how all these separate pieces might be joined into something larger, something that could hold together not for a season but for generations. Cyrus's earliest years would have unfolded within the boundaries of Anshan's royal household, a place that was not the sprawling marble and gold palace of later Persian kings, but a more modest seat, functional, fortified, and quietly refined in its own way, with its plastered walls, its timbered halls, its open courtyards where the air could move freely during the heat of the day. Here, in the cooler hours of morning, a young prince might be found in the company of a nurse or attendant, learning the first rhythms of the court, how to walk beside an elder without crowding them, how to greet visitors with a measured bow of the head, how to sit quietly and listen when older voices spoke of matters he could not yet understand. The scents that filled his world were those of freshly baked flatbread from the palace ovens, the faint tang of lime from the plaster walls, and the sharper smell of leather and oil that came from the harnesses of the horses stabled nearby. His days would have been shaped by the season's winter bringing cooler rains that softened the hard earth and filled the citterns, spring greening the slopes around the city and filling the air with the mixed aromas of new growth and tilled soil, summer pressing down with heat that shimmered above the packed dirt of the courtyards, and autumn carrying the scent of ripe grain and the dust of the threshing floor. As he grew old enough to leave the constant supervision of the women's quarters, Cyrus would have been led into the open training ground just beyond the palace's inner gate, where older boys and young men drilled with spears, practiced archery, and took their turns at wrestling under the watchful eyes of instructors whose patience was measured not in weeks, but in years of shaping discipline into those who would one day lead others. The ground there would be packed hard and bare, except for the lines traced in dust to mark positions, and the smell was always of sun-warmed earth and the dry fibers of red targets. He may have first been given a child's bow, its wood polished, smooth, its draw light enough for his still-growing arms, the string a tightly twisted cord that sang faintly when plucked. Later, heavier boughs of horn and wood would replace it, their weight teaching him both strength and precision. In time, a spear would be placed in his hands, not yet the full length and heft of a warrior's weapon, but a shorter shaft of polished wood tipped with a blunted head for practice, its balance teaching him how to feel the weapon as an extension of his own arm. Riding, too, would have been central, for a prince of Persia was expected to command not only men on foot, but cavalry, and to do that, he must know the language of the horse. The stables of Anshan would have been a place of constant motion, the sound of hooves on packed dirt, the deep breath of animals shifting their weight, the creak of leather saddles and bridles being adjusted, the steady rasp of a currycomb drawing dust from a glossy flank. He may have watched the grooms braid the manes of the horses to keep them from tangling in gear, their fingers deft and practiced, the faint scent of oiled leather and hay mixing with the sharper smell of sweat from both man and beast. Learning to ride would begin in the slow circles of the training pen, feeling the movement of the horse beneath him, learning to guide with the knees, to balance with the whole body, not just with the pull of the reins. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had eased, Cyrus might walk with an elder through the outer courts, passing soldiers on watch, their bronze fittings catching the last light, their spears grounded but ready. He would see the visitors who came to his father's envoys from other towns, traders leading small caravans, Median officials in their richly dyed garments. In those moments, he would be learning the other half of a prince's education. The reading of faces, the quiet gauging of who might be friend, who rival, who merely passing through. The palace library, if it can be called that, may have been no more than a set of rooms where clay tablets and scrolls were stored, but here too, he may have been brought to hear passages read aloud, laws, contracts, the older epics that carried the memory of Elamite kings and the deeds of heroes whose names were already ancient. It is likely that in the cool, dim light of those rooms, the smell of baked clay and papyrus filling the air, he began to understand that words could be a form of power, shaping the world as surely as armies did. The cycles of the year, the daily routines of court and training, the mingled scents and sounds of market and stable, hall and courtyard, all of these would form the steady background of his youth, weaving into him the instincts of a ruler long before he would have the chance to act as one. And though no one could have foreseen the scale of the empire he would one day command, it is not difficult to imagine that, in the quiet spaces between lessons, in the moments when he stood at the edge of the courtyard watching the hills fade into the evening haze, he was already storing away the images and understandings that would later guide his hand when the time came to shape the map itself. They tell in the quiet hours when the air is still and the fire burns low, a story that begins not with armies or treaties, but with a dream, the kind that troubles a ruler's sleep and lingers even in the daylight. Astyages, king of the Medes, is said to have dreamed that from his daughter Mandane flowed a stream so great that it overflowed the land, or in another telling that a vine sprang from her womb and grew until it shadowed the whole of Asia. Such dreams to ancient ears were not idle visions but messages from the realm of the divine, warnings or promises depending on how they were read, and for Astyages they were warnings, carrying the weight of fate. He summoned the Magi, interpreters of such signs, and they told him that the child born to Mandane would overthrow him. So the king, fearing the loss of his throne, did what fearful rulers have often done. He sought to stop the future before it could take shape. Mandane, already married to Cambyses, the Persian king of Anshan, gave birth to a son, and Astyages, true to his fear, ordered the infant's death. The child was given into the hands of a trusted courtier, Harpagus, who in turn, unwilling to kill the boy himself, entrusted the task to a herdsman. But the herdsman, whose own child had been stillborn, could not bring himself to carry out the order. Instead, he and his wife raised the boy as their own, the prince growing in the open air of the hills, learning to run with the other village boys, to wrestle and to climb, to drink from the cold springs that ran clear even in summer. In time, the truth of his birth emerged, perhaps through the boy's bearing, or through some slip of the tongue, and he was restored to his rightful family, his life preserved not by royal decree, but by the quiet defiance of those who chose compassion over obedience. Thus say the storytellers, the shadow of destiny followed him from the cradle, the prophecy still alive, waiting for its hour. Yet behind the weave of legend there was also the steady fabric of politics, less dramatic in its telling but no less decisive in shaping events. By the middle of the 6th century BC, the Median Empire was strong in name, but cracks had begun to show in its foundations. The Medes ruled over a patchwork of peoples, Persians among them, bound to them by alliances and the obligation of tribute. Such bonds can hold so long as the center remains firm, but under Astyages, discontent began to grow. Some of his nobles felt overlooked, others burdened by his policies, and among the vassal states, the desire for greater autonomy stirred quietly. Cyrus, by then the king of Anshan, was young but not untested, and he had learned the currents of loyalty and resentment that ran through the court. It is likely he spoke often with men like Harpagus now, a Median noble of influence who had his own reasons to resent Astyages, the old wound of the child order not forgotten. These conversations would not have been carried out in open defiance. but in the guarded language of those who know that words can cost lives. I shared glance across a hall, a remark that seemed about the weather but was meant for deeper understanding, a question about the strength of the Median garrisons in a certain province. Allies were gathered quietly, like dry twigs collected for a fire that will be lit only when the moment is right. When the break came, it was sudden to the watching world, though it had been long in preparation. Cyrus declared his revolt, not as a reckless throw of the dice, but as the next move in a game already half played. Astyages, angered, called his forces to arms, and the Medes marched to meet the Persians. The battle that followed is remembered in the accounts not for its slaughter, though men surely fell, but for its turn when part of the Median army, perhaps persuaded by promises or bound by loyalties older than their service to Astyages, went over to Cyrus. On the field, the movement of armies was marked by the slow rolling of dust clouds under the morning sun, banners lifting in the wind, their colors dulling as the light shifted. From a distance, the clash was more a shifting of lines than a scene of chaos, the sound carrying as a low, constant murmur like the sea against a long shore. Commands were given and answered, the shapes of the formations changing as one side pushed forward, the other bent and then broke. When at last the Median line collapsed, it was not with the roar of total ruin, but with the steady retreat of men who knew the day was lost. And then came the stillness, the dust settling in the late afternoon, the cries fading until the field was marked only by the figures of men moving among the fallen, gathering their own, securing the captured. Astyages was taken, not slain, and with that, the rule of the Medes ended. Cyrus, now master of both Persia and Media, did not destroy the Median system, but took it into his own, keeping its nobles close, adopting its administrative practices, blending the two realms into the beginnings of something greater. And in that choice victory without annihilation lay the first clear sign of the empire he would go on to build, an empire in which the conqueror's strength was matched by the patience to preserve what was worth keeping. When the Medes had yielded, Cyrus did not sweep away their institutions as a lesser conqueror might, eager to erase all that came before and replace it with his own imprint. Instead, he stepped into their halls, walked their stone-floored courtyards, and looked carefully at the structure of their governance, their methods of collecting tribute, their system of satraps, regional governors who knew the lands they oversaw and could maintain order without the constant presence of the king. Ecbatana, the Median capital, rose against the highland air with its ringed fortifications and storied walls, layered in colors said to shimmer from a distant band of white, black, red, blue, and at the heart, a palace with roofs that caught the light in pale gleam. The city had a rhythm that was different from Anshan. The calls of traders in the mountain markets carried further in the crisp air. The smell of pine mingled with the smoke of cook fires, the stone underfoot cool even in midday. Cyrus, now master of this place, kept much as it was, the satraps remaining in their posts, the army of the Medes now standing alongside his Persian troops. In the training grounds, one could see the blend, the Median cavalry with their long spears and heavy cloaks drilling beside Persian archers whose bows curved like crescents. Each learned from the other, and the cohesion that might have taken decades to grow began in these shared drills, in the quiet acceptance that they now served the same ruler. In this way, without tearing the fabric of what the Medes had woven, Cyrus made it part of his own garment of empire. From the highlands of Media his gaze turned west toward Lydia, where the kingdom of Croesus was famed for its wealth. The Pactolus river running through Sardis was said to bear gold in its sands, and the court of Croesus was a place where fine fabrics, worked gold and carved ivory, were not rarities, but the daily dress of power. The journey to Sardis led through lands that grew gentler, the air warming, the hills softening into valleys rich with orchards and vineyards. Yet the wealth that shone in Lydia also meant strength, for Croesus commanded seasoned armies and had allies among the Greek cities of Asia Minor. The meeting of these two powers began in the field, moved to the siege of Sardis, and ended in a swiftness that later storytellers would clothe in omens and prophecies. But in the slower truth of the matter, the siege was a quiet tightening, a ring of troops around the city. Supply lines cut, watchfires glowing each night beyond the walls. From within, the Lydians would have looked out to see the same patient pattern, the banners of Persia unmoving in the morning mist. The faint glint of armor in the midday sun, the sound of hammers from the siege works drifting faintly over the walls. When Sardis fell, it was not to the ruin of fire and destruction, but to capture in each place. He did not destroy. Croesus himself was spared, his wisdom later said to have been valued in Cyrus's own court. The city's markets reopened under new banners. The Pactolus still ran with its sands, and the satrapy of Lydia was added to the growing map of the empire. its wealth flowing now toward a capital farther east. Then there was Babylon, the city whose name carried the weight of centuries, its walls so high and thick that they were spoken of as unassailable. It lay on the flat plains beside the Euphrates, its processional way lined with glazed brick walls in deep blues and golds, the reliefs of lions and dragons walking beside the traveler as if in silent procession. Approaching Babylon meant days of seeing its walls grow slowly in the distance, the land around it carefully cultivated, canals drawing the river's water into fields of grain and date palms. Cyrus's army did not hurl itself in futile assault against those walls. Instead, they turned to the river itself. The Euphrates was diverted into channels, its waters lowered enough that, on a chosen night, the troops could move along the emptied riverbed beneath the walls. Inside the city, the people were said to have been at a festival, the night warm, the lamps of the streets, and homes glowing in the still air. The Persian soldiers entered not with fire and shouting, but in measured silence, their footsteps muffled by the silt of the riverbed, their forms emerging into the lamplight only when they had already passed into the heart of the city. In each place, he did not destroy Babylon's temples remained. Its priests continued their rites, the city's scribes still set their seals to contracts, and one group in particular, the Jewish exiles, were permitted to return to their homeland, their freedom granted by decree. And so Babylon too was bound into the web of the empire, its wealth and its deep traditions now part of the same system that reached back to Ecbatana and Sardis. The journey from one to the other was no longer across borders of suspicion and rivalry, but along the roads of a single realm, under the authority of a king who had come to each and, without erasing what they were, had made them part of something larger, something meant to endure. Cyrus's manner of rule, as it emerged from these great conquests, was not defined by the fevered drive to obliterate what had come before, but by the quieter, more deliberate act of absorbing it into a broader, folding it into a broader fabric without tearing apart the existing weave. In each new land he entered, the cities were not leveled in displays of might, their temples were not burned to proclaim the superiority of his own gods, and their people were not uprooted en masse to prevent rebellion. Instead, Cyrus observed, selected, and preserved. In media, he kept the satrapal system, leaving experienced governors in place, understanding that these men knew their territories, their roads and passes, their markets and seasons far better than a stranger could learn in a handful of years. In Lydia, the trade routes and minting of coin continued without interruption, the same artisans striking the same designs into the same gold, only now under a Persian-appointed overseer who reported back to the central court. In Babylon, whose complexity of law, ritual, and social hierarchy was among the most intricate in the known world, Cyrus confirmed the privileges of the priesthood, kept the calendar of festivals unchanged, and allowed the legal scribes to keep inscribing contracts, deeds, and court decisions in the same cuneiform script they had used for generations. Such acts were not born from indifference, but from an active recognition that the strength of an empire lay in the stability of its parts that a land forced to abandon its own rhythms would resist and weaken the whole, whereas a land allowed to keep them would, in time, shift its loyalty to the ruler who had made that stability possible. Other rulers of his time and of centuries before had chosen differently. Assyrian kings had boasted in their inscriptions of cities razed to the ground, of walls torn down and foundations salted so that nothing would grow there again, of whole populations deported to break the ties between people and place. Such measures, while terrifying and effective in the short term, left behind scars that could not heal, resentment that waited for the first sign of weakness to rise again. Cyrus's policy, by contrast, treated the conquered not as a vanquished mass to be subdued forever, but as future partners in the work of empire. By respecting their traditions, by allowing them to worship in their own temples, by maintaining local laws where they did not conflict with imperial stability, he created a sense, however gradual, that being under Persian rule did not mean the end of one's identity. In the Jewish community of Babylon, the proclamation that they could return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple was not merely an act of benevolence, but a calculated demonstration of this philosophy, that Cyrus was the protector, not the suppressor of the sacred. The message was clear: loyalty to him was compatible with loyalty to one's own gods. The satrapies, the regional divisions of the empire, became the backbone of this structure. Each was governed by a satrap, often drawn from the local nobility or from Persians who had proven themselves trustworthy, and each was given considerable autonomy in the details of administration. They collected taxes, raised troops, maintained order, and in return were expected to send tribute and obey the directives of the great king. The system allowed for the vast distances of the empire from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea to be managed without constant intervention from the center. Roads linked these territories, and with them came the steady exchange of goods, ideas, and even styles of art and architecture. One could travel from Sardis to Susa and see, in the capitals of each satrapy, traces of both the local tradition and the imperial presence. Median stonework alongside Babylonian brick reliefs. Lydian goldsmithing sharing display space with Persian silverware. In such blending, the empire became more than the sum of its parts. In this approach lay a certain restraint, rare in rulers with the means to impose their will absolutely. Cyrus could have filled every capital with monuments to himself, replacing local symbols with his own, forcing the use of a single language in administration, banning local faiths in favor of the Persian pantheon. Such acts might have made his personal mark more visible in the short term, but they would also have sown deep instability. Instead, he chose to build his authority on recognition of the strength already present in these lands, recognition of the value in continuity, recognition that legitimacy could be rooted as much in the perception of fairness as in the fear of force. Thus, when the Persians came to be seen not as destroyers, but as guarantors of order, the empire's hold on its territories deepened, not through the constant presence of armies, but through the consent, however practical, of those it governed. And so, in the slow turning of years, the conquests of Cyrus became not tales of devastation but of incorporation. The Median cavalry rode alongside Persian infantry, the gold of Lydia flowed into imperial treasuries without vanishing from local markets. The priests of Babylon lit their lamps as they always had, their prayers spoken in the same words to the same gods, under the watch of a ruler who, in his own temples, gave thanks to Ahura Mazda. It was an empire in which the thread of each conquered people was woven into a larger cloth, its colors preserved, its strength drawn from the harmony of its weaver philosophy that, in the centuries to come, would be remembered as one of the reasons the name of Cyrus carried not only the weight of power, but the quiet respect of those who lived under it. In the last chapter of Cyrus's life, the stage was set not in the halls of a palace or the markets of a great city, but far to the east in lands, where the empire met the edge of the known world, where the cultivated fields gave way to stretches of open steppe and scattered ranges of low mountains, their slopes marked by the paths of herds and the faint smoke of distant encampments. Here the light seemed sharper, the sky stretching without interruption from horizon to horizon, the air carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint mineral tang of wind that had traveled far over barren stone. The campaign that brought him here is remembered in fragments, mentions of tribes whose names were half lost even to his contemporaries, descriptions of journeys across river valleys where the water ran cold and quick, edged with reeds that whispered in the wind. But the details of battle are not what remain most vividly. Rather, it is the sense of distance, of a ruler at the very edge of the lands he had brought under one crown, standing where the road ahead was no longer a road but an expanse without markers, where every direction seemed possible and none was yet certain. The campaign did not end in triumphal return, but in the stillness that follows a life's work when the hand that shaped it is gone. When news of his death reached the heart of the empire, whether carried by swift riders or by slower caravans, bearing both word and the body itself, preparations were made for his burial at Pasargadae, the first great capital of the Persian kings, the city he had built as a statement of both authority and vision. There on the plain, his tomb still stands, a structure of simple and deliberate form, its base a stepped platform of pale stone, each layer slightly smaller than the one below, leading the eye upward to the small, gabled chamber at its summit. The stone itself holds the warmth of the morning light, glowing softly when the sun rises over the open land, casting long angled shadows across the steps. The air here is still, broken only by the faint rustle of wildflowers that grow at the tomb's base in the spring, their colors yellows, purples, the occasional pale white set against the weathered gold of the stone. The plain stretches away in every direction, the mountains distant enough to seem like the edge of the sky, and the silence is deep enough that one might hear the faint call of a bird wheeling high above, the sound carrying in the open air. Standing here, it is possible to imagine the procession that once approached, courtiers in long robes, soldiers in ordered ranks, banners lifted, but still in the absence of wind, the measured tread of those who carried the body, the scent of incense rising in slow curls from bronze burners. The chamber itself, plain and enclosed, held the sarcophagus, the walls unadorned except for the weight of what they contained. There are accounts perhaps embroidered by later generations. that spoke of an inscription once carved here, words that named Cyrus as the King of Kings, the founder of the empire, and asked the passerby not to begrudge him this small monument. Whether or not the words were ever truly there, the feeling they convey still hangs in the air, the sense that here lies a man who might have claimed a greater tomb, richer ornaments, the spoils of a lifetime of conquest, but chose instead a resting place marked by clarity and proportion, enduring in its simplicity. The sun moves slowly across the sky at Pasargadae, and as it does, the light changes on the stone, warming it at midday, softening it toward evening, until the last glow slips away and the tomb is held in shadow under the first pale stars. It is a place that does not shout its significance, but lets the land itself, the air, the silence, carry the weight of memory. And so the story of Cyrus comes to a pause here, not in the clash of arms or the proclamation of victory, but in the stillness of the plain, where the empire's founder rests, the roads he built stretching outward in every direction, leading to lands that, in his lifetime, he had bound together not by destruction, but by the steady work of inclusion, preservation, and rule. If you have followed the long road of Cyrus's life in your mind, you may now begin to see how the choices he made, choices that might have seemed at the time like matters of immediate strategy or convenience, or in truth the laying down of patterns, meant to endure much as the line of the immortals endures beyond the span of any one man's service. When we think of empire, we often imagine the moments of founding as sudden, born in the heat of victory, but here the founding was as much about what was allowed to remain as about what was newly built. The satrapies he confirmed, the temples he spared, the laws he let continue in their accustomed form, all of these were like the stones laid into a road. A single stone may seem small, unremarkable, but laid in careful alignment with the next, it makes a path that can carry travelers far beyond the lifetime of its builder. For the immortals, whose task is to guard not only the person of the king but the stability of the empire itself, the roads they march on, and the order they maintain are, in the quiet sense, a continuation of his vision. Each station they pass through, each garrison they staff, exists because the land around it has not been left in ruin, but has been integrated into something greater. Its markets still open, its fields still worked. Imagine, if you will, the steady line of immortals moving along a road that threads through many lands, past Lydian vineyards where grapes hang heavy in the late summer, past Babylonian canals edged with date palms, past Median highland villages where smoke curls from hearths as it has for generations, place different in tongue and custom, yet bound together by the same authority, the same protection, the same possibility of safe passage. In such a line, the man at the front and the man at the rear do not know each other's names, yet they are part of the same unbroken formation, just as the cities of the empire, far apart and different in character, are part of the same whole. This is the heart of the tie between past and present, the knowledge that what was built with care and foresight can outlast the builder, that the order of a regiment, like the order of a realm, depends not on the immortality of any one life, but on the willingness of each generation to take its place in the line, to hold the formation steady for those who will come after. And so, as the night deepens around our campfire of memory, and the story turns from the man who founded the empire to the places within it where mystery and wonder still dwell, we can walk with ease into our next chapter, knowing that the roads are sound, the watch is kept, and the vision that shaped it all still lingers in the order of the march. The journey toward Persepolis begins not with the sudden sight of towering columns or the immediate impression of grandeur, but with a slow unfolding that draws the traveler into its rhythm long before the ruins themselves come into view. For the plain on which it stands is broad and unhurried, a vast open sheet of land beneath an immense sky, and the act of crossing it is as much a part of the encounter as the arrival. The grasses here are the pale gold of sun-bleached memory, their seed heads swaying with a kind of subtle, ceaseless motion that the eye can only appreciate when it lingers, each blade catching a slightly different angle of light so that the whole field seems to shimmer faintly, like a woven cloth stirred by some unseen hand. The wind, though steady, is gentle, its sound more of a soft, continuous breath than a whistle, as if the land itself is exhaling after centuries of holding still, carrying with it the dry, mineral scent of warm dust mixed with fleeting traces of green from distant stands of shrubs or low trees that cluster where some hidden spring rises briefly before sinking again beneath the earth. Beneath your feet, the ground is firm, a hard-packed mixture of fine dust and pale gravel that crunches softly under each step, the sound quickly absorbed into the openness around you. From time to time the surface changes almost imperceptibly, firmer where old paths have been worn by countless feet, looser where the wind has dropped a thin skin of sand, and each variation draws your attention downward before your gaze is lifted again to the horizon. At first, the eye meets nothing but the line where earth and sky touch in a long, unbroken sweep, the pale blue above deepening almost imperceptibly toward the zenith, empty save for the slow, deliberate flight of a single bird, whose call falls into the stillness like a bead of water into a wide, still pool. You walk without hurry, measuring the distance, not in minutes but in the rhythm of your breath, the gentle swing of your arms, the steady alternation of heel and toe, and then, slowly, so slowly that you might at first think it a trick of the light, something begins to break the line of the horizon, a few vertical strokes, thin and irregular, wavering slightly in the heat haze. They could be the bare trunks of distant trees, or perhaps the poles of some herdsman's encampment, but as you draw on, they separate themselves from the mirage and show their true proportions, taller and straighter than any tree could grow here, crowned with shapes that, though still indistinct, suggest deliberate carving rather than the random forms of nature. Step by step, the verticals clarify into columns, their fluted shafts worn smooth by centuries of wind, their capitals spreading like the wings of some great stone creature, and between them glimpses of open sky where once there would have been beams and roofs. The nearer you come, the more the approach takes on the quality of a slow unveiling, each shift in distance revealing something new while still holding back the full picture, as if the place itself prefers to be met gradually, without the shock of sudden disclosure. With the columns now clear to sight, your attention begins to register the mass of the terrace on which they stand, its base rising from the plain in steps of pale weathered stone, each layer marked by the shadow that the next casts upon it in the morning light. These shadows move almost imperceptibly as clouds pass overhead, softening the edges one moment, then sharpening them in the next, and you find yourself slowing further, the better to notice how the forms change. Along the lower walls, faint lines emerge, at first just the suggestion of pattern, but then resolving into the delicate, time-softened reliefs of figures and procession men in long robes, their garments falling in carefully carved folds, their hair and beards arranged in patterns that speak of an artistry now long past. They walk in ordered lines, bearing vessels, textiles, animals, their faces turned in profile toward some point that once held meaning at the heart of the complex. The details are worn, yet enough remains to show the precision with which they were made, and the repetition of form figure after figure, step after step seems to echo the very cadence of your own approach. Here, on the plain, the silence is deep, broken only by the sigh of the wind and the faint crunch of your footsteps. Yet in that silence it is possible to imagine the soundscape of long ago, the murmur of many voices in many tongues, the measured tread of soldiers on the staircases, the chime of ornaments against vessels carried in procession, the brief calls of attendants directing movement through the gates. In your mind, the air grows warmer, touched with the scent of incense rising from bronze burners, the faint temps of oil lamps burning in shaded halls. Banners move gently above the crowd, their colors bright against the stone, the sky beyond them as blue as it is today, but framed by roofs and porticos now lost. Yet these imagined layers do not come all at once, but drift in and out as you pause to take in the scene before you in its present form. Columns standing solitary against the open sky stairways, rising to nowhere walls that end abruptly where once they joined others in enclosing space. The nearer you draw, the more the scale of the place asserts itself, not through the overwhelming mass of the structures, for many have fallen, but through the careful proportion of what remains. The width of the steps, shallow enough to allow the slow, measured pace of a formal ascent, the breadth between columns, set to frame a view outward as much as to support a roof, the height of the bas-reliefs placed to meet the gaze of someone ascending from below. Each detail speaks of a place designed to impress not through speed or suddenness, but through the gradual accumulation of effect, much as your own approach across the plain has prepared you for it. And so, without haste, you find yourself at the base of the great terrace, looking up at the first flight of stone steps, the wind now carrying faint echoes in its movement around the standing columns above, as if the air itself remembers the spaces it once moved through when the halls were whole, the gates closed, and the city alive. Standing at the foot of the terrace, you begin to understand that what persists at Persepolis is not only mass and measure, but touch the quiet record of contact inscribed where hands steadied themselves on corners, where sandals wore a shallow sheen into steps, where the wind itself has abraded the stone into a softness that catches light like skin. The first riser under your toes is low and wide, designed for a procession that moved with ceremony rather than haste. And the surface of the step tells different stories depending on where you look. In the center, where feet have climbed most often, the limestone is gently polished, its pores filled by time and pressure until it reflects the morning a shade brighter. Along the margins, where wind carries less grit and fewer souls have passed, the original tooth of the chisel lingers in faint, parallel striations, each a tiny furrow that breaks the light into pale, granular sparkle. When you lay a palm on the vertical face of the stair, you can feel a gradation from cool shade to sun warmth in the span of a hand, the stone becoming almost silky where afternoon light will later rest, and remaining faintly chalky where the overhang protects it. Ascending slowly, you step into the broad breadth of the platform and the gate of all nations lifts calmly into view. Not as a shock of height, but as a measured arrangement of mass and void that draws the eye upward without straining it. Two square piers hold the memory of vast length, and from them rise paired columns whose fluted shafts have been weather-rounded so that the grooves read more as soft channels than sharp incisions, the capitals spreading with a deliberate, almost conversational generosity, as if the stone were demonstrating what it means to carry weight without complaint. The guardian figures at the bases human-headed bulls with folded wings, bare faces softened by centuries of sun, wind, and rare rain, the crisp line of a beard now a gentle pattern of plains, the curl of a horn more suggestion than diagram, yet the total effect remains imposing in a way that is not theatrical but assured, like a host who does not need to announce authority because the room itself already knows. When you pass beneath, your footfall acquires an echo that is faint but unmistakable, a rounding of sound that lingers half a heartbeat after each step, enough to convince you that volumes matter here, that empty space is as much a material as limestone, and that even in ruin the gate continues to perform its original work of framing movement and dignifying the act of arrival. On either side, the surviving walls hold bas-reliefs that reveal themselves in layers as your eyes adjust. From a distance they are a pattern, from arm's length they are a procession, and from the shade of your hand formed into a visor, they are a library of textures, pleated garments falling in even cascades whose regularity speaks of a carver's steady wrist, braided hair rendered as tiny nested chevrons that break the light into a soft, matte shimmer, sandals etched with a line or two to suggest straps, enough for the mind to complete the rest without feeling hurried, animals from many lands led gently by cords that have nearly vanished, but can still be traced in shallow grooves across polished bellies and shoulders, vessels held forward in offering with rims so slightly raised that a raking sun can still find them, tipping their circles into visibility for a few minutes each day. The faces are profiles, firm yet uninsistent, some with eyes that appear almost closed now because the upper lid has worn down to meet a lower line, an effect that lends the whole procession a meditative calm. The repetition is not dullness but rhythm, a series of almost identical gestures that together describe an order. The same gesture repeated by many hands, the same step repeated by many feet, the same approach enacted season after season. You notice how each delegation is set apart by a small but patient, different sats of felt or of soft cloth carved with a differing curve, the hem of a robe edged in a pattern that another group does not share, the tail of a brought animal lifted or lowered in a way that quietly signals its kind, and the overall impression is not a variety clamoring for attention but a variety tamed by a shared pace. As if the stone itself had asked all these far lands to speak more slowly so that the message could be understood. The columns beyond the gate rise in measured rows across the terrace, survivors of a forest of stone that once supported roof and ceiling. At their bases, rounded plinths are worn smooth where dust and sandals have described circles through centuries of curiosity, and at their tops the capitals still hold the stumps of tenons where wooden beams once nested, the cut sockets now shallow basins that cradle small wind-blown grit after a shower. A fingertip brushed across a shaft feels both the soft polish of exposure and, in pockets sheltered by a fluted groove, a faint sugar of unweathered stone, a reminder that even in the open, architecture creates its own quiet climates. Between columns, the floor is a puzzle of paving blocks fitted with such care that their seams, although widened by thermal breath and age, still meet in long, intelligible lines. In 3 or 4 places you notice discrete, modern interventions, a thin metal dowel pinning a vulnerable edge, a line of low rope guiding feet away from a fragile patch, a small label set back from the view, and details so modest they dissolve once you lift your gaze, leaving the larger logic of the site undisturbed. The preservation speaks in the same calm register as the ruins themselves, A brush of dust removed here, a joint stabilized. They're not to restore a vanished whole, but to respect what remains with the restraint it deserves. Along another stair, the stone's story changes with exposure. On the sunward side, the risers carry a faint glassy sweat of mineral polish where light has slid for centuries. On the windward side, a fine stipple announces the ceaseless kiss of grit, an abrasion that has softened tooling into velvet. Place your hand flat and the temperature tilts heat. On the east faces, where morning has rested. Coolness on the west, where the day has yet to turn, and the contrast invites you to imagine how these surfaces participated in time when the palace stood complete. Warm in festival mornings when emissaries climbed and measured files. Cool in evenings when officials descended with wax tablets tucked under arms. Coolness deepening to chill on winter nights when lamps low on oil surrendered to stars. Beneath your feet, shallow channels hint at drainage, their lips rounded by flow. And at thresholds you find circular sockets where doorposts once pivoted, the edges worn smooth by turning weight. A step farther and there are mortises cut into wall tops, tidy rectangles where cedar beams once sat, the wood long vanished, the negative space still eloquent. On one face of a pier, a rectangle of paler stone implies that a plaque once hung there, perhaps an inscription in compact wedge-cut script. The plaque is gone. The lighter shade remains. A ghostly frame that keeps the absent message present without sound. If you allow your gaze to rest on the pale, weathered surfaces of Persepolis and do not force the mind forward but instead let it drift in its own time, the reconstruction of the past can begin without abruptness, as though the present-day ruin and its former life are simply two states of the same object, separated by the lightest of veils. At first, the change is in the tone of the stone, the soft beige gradually deepening into warmer shades, as if the sun had taken a more generous hold, and then color, once lost to wind and rain, begins to seep back into the carvings, not in the sudden saturation of modern paint, but in the slow re-emergence of memory. Deep, velvety reds anchoring the backgrounds, calm blues filling the spaces between folds of clothing, and accents of gold leaf so thin they seem to float upon the surface, catching the light at certain angles like the faintest shimmer on still water. The reliefs, their edges now sharpened by restored pigment, begin to suggest motion, though it is not the hurried movement of a bustling crowd but the deliberate, almost meditative pace of a ceremonial procession, each figure stepping forward with a rhythm practiced countless times before, one foot gliding to rest before the other begins to lift. Textiles, folded with geometric precision, are carried in long swathes over forearms, their patterns rendered in interlocking shapes of crimson and cream. The weave so finely depicted that you can imagine the slight give beneath the carrier's grip. Vessels of worked metal gleam with chaste design spirals, leaves, and wave motifs, each ripple of ornament catching a narrow slice of light as the bearer tilts the object ever so slightly to keep balance. Among them are emissaries leading animals whose grooming speaks to weeks of preparation, horses with manes divided into even, beaded braids that move with a faint chiming when the wind or a shift in weight sets them swaying. Camels whose saddles are hung with tassels of dyed wool, their muted clink of metal fittings barely audible beneath the low, textured murmur of many languages, Lydian, Egyptian, Babylonian blending into a continuous soundscape that is more tone than speech, a background hum punctuated only by the measured contact of sandals against polished limestone, a dry, soft tap that repeats like a heartbeat across the vast platform. Above, vast awnings of woven cloth stretch between the high columns, filtering the sunlight into an even, diffuse glow that softens all shadow edges and gives the whole space the calm of an overcast day despite the brilliant sky beyond. The colors, sounds, and textures are not overbearing but integrated into an environment designed to absorb them into its geometry, so that everything gesture, step, sound, scent feels proportionate to the whole in which it occurs. Moving inward toward the more enclosed courts, the air shifts almost imperceptibly. The dry clarity of the open terrace gives way to something layered, as if the air itself has absorbed the sense and warmth of human presence. From low braziers in shaded recesses, threads of incense smoke rise and dissipate before they reach eye level, but their scent resinous, faintly sweet, with a grounding note like cedar or cypress remains catching, gently in the back of the throat and blending with the subtler smells of worked leather, warm cloth, and the faint tang of metal polished to a high sheen. In small, self-contained groups, courtiers stand in quiet conversation, their heads inclined toward one another, voices kept low not for secrecy but to match the measured calm of the language of their posture is as deliberate as that of their words, hands folded behind the back or resting, lightly on the shaft of a staff. Feet placed square to the listener, no wasted motion. Nearby, scribes sit with styluses poised over wax tablets. The sound of their work no louder than the soft rasp of cloth against stone as a robe's hem shifts. Others write on parchment or prepared skins, the brush or reed pen leaving its own faint whisper in the air. From deeper in the hall comes the occasional quiet chime of metal, perhaps a bracelet settling on a wrist or a clasp shifting against fabric, each sound brief and self-contained. Absorbed by the vast volume of the room, servants move among these clusters without interruption, carrying low trays of figs, dates, and small honeyed cakes, their surfaces sometimes catching the muted gleam of gold or silver dishes. Wine, poured from painted clay pitchers, carries with it the scent of the fruit and the earth it grew from, but never so much as to dominate the air. Even the act of serving is deliberate, the vessel tipped slowly, the cup steadied with a second hand, the exchange performed at a pace that ensures no spillage, no break in conversation. The light here is a composite lamplight from niches, merging with the softened daylight filtering through the high narrow window's end on the gold of a vessel's rim or the polished hilt of a dagger. It catches in a way that draws the eye, not with sudden brightness, but with the kind of steady glint you notice only after you have been looking for a while. The result is a setting that feels at once complete and unhurried, its ceremony sustained not by spectacle but by the consistent alignment of architecture, movement, sound, and scent. And because the transition from the bare pale ruin to this imagined fullness has been gradual, you never feel you have been transported, only that you have been reminded of something that has always been here, waiting quietly in the lines of the stone and the measure of the space for you to see it again. If you move through Persepolis with a patience that matches the site's own, letting your steps fall softly and your gaze settle where the limestone holds shadow, the questions arrive without insisting on answers, more like low notes than loud demands. And they draw the mind into a gentle curiosity. Why here, on this terrace lifted from the plain, with the mountains gathered close behind like a quiet audience, and the open land before it like a long pale road of air and light? It is possible that the location was chosen for practical reasons, a nearby source of workable stone, slopes easy enough to engineer into broad platforms, water close enough to be managed by channels and cisterns, yet, even as you acknowledge the practical, you feel the suggestion of something more, a sense that the place reads well against the horizon, that the afternoon light washes the facades in a steady gold visible from far away, that the mountains hold the wind in a way that keeps fire steady and banners calm, that the terrace is a kind of stage designed not to surprise but to present. Perhaps the founders wanted a capital that was ceremonial rather than administrative, a place set apart from the bustle of ordinary governance so that rituals of greeting, gift, giving, and pledges of loyalty could unfold without intrusion. Perhaps the very distance from river cities and older centers was a statement, a new alignment of power toward a heartland that was both ancestral and aspirational. Perhaps the choice was shaped by considerations we can no longer measure, pilgrimage paths that no longer exist, sightlines to stars recorded in traditions now lost, associations of rock and hill carried in stories that were never written down. The site encourages such thoughts because it is eloquent in what it shows and equally eloquent in what it withholds. The archaeologist's work answers this eloquence with its own language of care and sequence. You might see them at first light, when the stone is cool and the wind barely stirs, laying out a grid in thin twine that hums softly. If you pluck it, each square assigned a number, each number a promise that what is found there will be recorded and remembered. A trowel's edge slides under a thin crust of dust, not to pry, but to lift, and the loosened film is brushed aside in strokes so light that the bristles whisper rather than scratch. When a fragment of carved relief emerges the curl of a beard, the hem of a garment, it is not pulled but circled, its context mapped in notes and photographs, the place where it lay becoming part of its meaning. A conservator kneels with a magnifying visor and a small vial, delivering a drop of consolidant into a powdering groove to hold its edge against another season of sun and wind. Nearby, an epigrapher leans over a face of stone with tightly cut wedges of cuneiform, tracing the lines with the eye first, then with a soft pencil on translucent paper, building a mirror of the inscription that can travel to a table in shade, where colleagues debate whether this wedge is shallow from damage or was cut that way to indicate a particular sound. You may hear the shudders of a camera taking systematic images for photogrammetry, the click measured, the lens held steady at intervals that will later stitch into a three-dimensional record, where every nick and ripple can be measured without the stone itself being touched. You may notice a small sphere tucked into a corner taking hourly readings of temperature and humidity, because knowledge here grows not only from what is uncovered, but from how what is already uncovered will survive. The work is slow because slowness is faithful to the sight, and where certainty is impossible, the language on the context sheet gives it room, perhaps from an upper course, possibly secondary deposition. Pigment trace not confirmed, notes as calm and provisional as the ruin itself. You cross open courts whose dimensions suggest gatherings, and you wonder whether these were waiting spaces before formal audiences or places for delegations to arrange themselves by region and rank. The absence of built-in seating suggests standing ceremonies, but perhaps wooden benches once lined the shade, their imprint gone. But for a faint difference in patina near the base of certain walls. Along one stair, a sequence of shallow sockets in the tread edges could be the anchors for a temporary railing or for ceremonial poles strung with textiles on festival days. It is possible that here on certain mornings of the year colored banners were raised so that their shadows fell in a particular pattern across the reliefs, a moving lattice of shade that braided cloth with stone. In a narrower suite of rooms, the turnings are too many to be casual. A bend left, a short corridor, a bend right, another short run, then a door. Such planning hints at procedures, perhaps the measured progression of officials through stages of preparation before they entered a hall to speak, perhaps the guiding of petitioners past points where their names and gifts were recorded by scribes, perhaps something sacred whose steps we cannot reconstruct. The floors offer small clues if you kneel, a lighter stripe along the edge where mats may have softened the tread, a faint polish in a central strip that betrays the most used path through a doorway. A shallow dish-shaped depression near a threshold that could have held a lamp or a bowl of water for washing hands before entering a room of importance. In a corner, tiny dark flecks embedded in a crackled charcoal, perhaps not enough to tell a story of fire, just enough to say that at some point flame lived quietly here. Elsewhere, a thin line of red clings in the sheltered depth of a carved fold, too slight to restore the whole palette, but sufficient to allow the mind to color the garments softly without straining. The platform's edge preserves cut channels that once guided runoff away from vulnerable men's, a practical grace that also suggests an ear for sound. Water moving in the rainy months would have added a low steady hush to the court, perhaps balancing the murmur of voices with the white noise of flow. Now they lie dry and the hush is wind alone. The absences become their own archive. Beams of cedar or cypress that once crossed high spaces now vanished but recorded in rectangular mortises where their ends sat. Doors, whose leaves and lintels were wood bound with metal, long gone except for pivot stones polished to a dark gloss by turning weight, and sockets whose edges are rounded by the same motion. Textiles that once softened walls hangings, dyed in blue and red patterned with animals and plants now remembered only as paler rectangles, where stone protected from light and air aged differently than exposed faces. Carpets or red mats that would have made footsteps hush, their presence guessed by strips of floor preserved smoother than surrounding stone. Even the scent profile has been erased, leaving only a thought of aromas that once marked rooms by function. The resin warmth of incense in a ceremonial space, the faint tartness of wine and fruit in a serving area, the clean oil of well-maintained gear in a guardroom. If you pause now, in the heart of the terrace, where the air sits in its broad stillness, and the only sound is the slow stroke of wind against stone, the space speaks with its present voice, an echo that carries not words but the bare shape of sound, moving up through the columns and out into the open plain, but it also leaves room for another layer, one that you can allow to form gently, as though coaxed from the edges of memory. For while the stones today stand bare and the courts lie quiet enough that your own footsteps feel like an intrusion, it is possible without hurrying, without breaking the comtu. Imagine these same halls once filled not with air alone but with a low, continuous presence of human gathering, lamplight rising from bronze stands and oil bowls, casting a steady, honey-colored glow that softens the edges of carved reliefs and gives depth to the painted figures on the walls. The slow, measured lines of guests moving inward from the outer courts, the faint lift of music threading through the open doors, not a clamor but the patient, interwoven sound of lyres, flutes, and hand drums, the scents blending in the still air, beginning with the clean smoke of resinous wood on the braziers and folding into the warmer, heavier aromas of bread pulled from clay ovens, of meats turning on spits where spices crackle in the heat, of honey melting into grains in covered pots. You might think of the stone underfoot as it was then, hidden beneath carpets and woven mats, giving back not the tap of sandal on limestone, but the softened hush of fabric pressed flat by countless steps. Along the great halls, tables of low height arranged in patterns that left space for servers to pass, their wooden surfaces hidden beneath layers of cloth and bright with the gold of cups, the polished bronze of platters, the deep red glaze of certain bowls. The hum of voices, not loud, but carrying the tonal range of many languages, would have risen and fallen with the service. Some conversations brief and formal, others lingering like the taste of spiced wine. In the pauses between courses, the music would fill the space again, a sound designed to flow with the measured pace of the evening rather than drive it forward. And beyond the lit courts, the darker edges of the terrace would have been watched over by the Immortals, their silhouettes steady against the lamplight, the soft gleam of a spearhead or helmet catching the glow before returning to shadow. The very presence of their line serving as the unspoken frame for all within, as if to say that what happened here, be it council ceremony or feast, was held secure within the bounds of imperial order. And yet, even in such fullness, the architecture would have absorbed the life of the moment without strain, its columns and terraces designed to contain both silence and celebration. This dual capacity is part of its endurance, and in that endurance, you can see the continuation of Cyrus's vision, an empire bound not only by force of arms but by places that embodied the stability and dignity of the whole, places where the far provinces could feel themselves gathered in to a common center. The Immortals, whose daily march and watch you have already traced in your mind, were not only the sword at the edge of the empire, but the still pillars at its heart, their vigilance extending to these imperial spaces where politics met ritual, and where the empire's image was made tangible in ceremony. The same discipline that kept them steady on campaign kept them steady at the palace gates, ensuring that the transition from quiet ruin to imagined banquet is not a leap into fantasy but a recollection of what their presence made possible. So as you stand now in the emptiness, the silence does not erase the gatherings of kings but holds them in reserve, waiting for you to bring them forward in thought. And as you picture the long tables set, the air warm with food and music, the halls layered with the sound of measured voices, you can begin to follow the faint line from these stones into the next part of our journey, into the feast itself, where protocol and abundance meet, where the empire's wealth is laid out not as a display of excess, but as a confirmation of its reach and its order, where the same halls that now open to the wind once closed gently against the night, holding within them the glow, the scent, and the slow rhythm of a royal evening that spoke without haste of the stability the Immortals guarded and the unity Cyrus imagined. The approach to the palace on a banquet night unfolds as a sequence of small thresholds that guide the senses from the open plain to the sheltered center, each transition measured almost ceremonial in its restraint, so that the change never startles but accumulates gently, until you are entirely within the world of the feast. You begin outside on the terrace where the day's heat is ebbing from the stone, and the air has that mingled character of evening cool against the face yet faintly warm near the ground, as if the sun remains as a memory underfoot, and the sounds are broad and unlocalized. Wind moving across open space, a bird's last call thinning into distance, a few voices, carried from far corners of the platform and flattened into a soft, indistinct murmur. From here, the palace reads first as silhouettes, then as surfaces, and finally as spaces that gather you in. Along the outer stair, the limestone steps are banded with light that has turned from white to honey, and at the foot of the flight, a brazier shielded by a low bronze screen sends out a steady exhale of resin-scented warmth that brushes your hands as you pass. The guardians at this threshold, the Immortals posted 2 and 2, spears upright, shield rims leveled, hold their stillness with a care that feels like another layer of architecture, their discipline becoming part of the building's silence. They recognize arrivals with the smallest inclination of the head, not a nod, so much as the suggestion of assent, a signal that affirms your place in the night's order without drawing attention to itself. Immediately beyond, attendants in plain, long robes position themselves at measured intervals, neither crowding nor withdrawing, each at the exact place where a guest might need quiet guidance. One to receive a travel cloak and fold it over an arm so the fabric's scent of cool air and dust does not follow you inward. One to indicate whether you move left or right at the top of the stair. One to step a pace ahead and show the appropriate doorway, never turning a back to a guest but gliding sideways with practiced economy. Here the first etiquette of precedence is felt in the choreography of paths. Those of higher rank are directed along the central axis where the ceiling lifts earliest and the lamplight is warmest, while those whose honor is real but not paramount are brought by flanking corridors that are dimmer and narrower, yet no less carefully kept. Couples separate with a glance and rejoin at the next court. if custom calls for it. A brief pause allowing for the slight reordering that shows who follows whom. The space itself enforcing courtesy without instruction. Within these passages, the air changes again, taking on a layered character as the outdoor breeze yields to currents set by interior volumes, a gently rising warmth near the brazier mouths, a cooler thread descending from high windows where the last pale stripe of sky is admitted and diluted into the lamplit air. Lamps themselves are arranged in a hierarchy that answers the hierarchy of rooms, large shallow bowls on bronze stems at the perimeters of courts, their flames shielded from wind so they cast a steady, low radiance across paving and column bases. Smaller oil lamps sit in niches at shoulder height along corridors, producing ovals of light that overlap just enough to help the eye mark doorways and steps. In the great hall, light multiplies by reflection rather than by intensity. Low stands, topped with polished metal plates, catch and widen the small flames gold cup rims pick up and soften. The brightness in a warm ring that moves only when a hand moves, and the glazed surfaces of large storage jars placed in recesses gather light and give it back as a mild, watery gleam. There is no glare anywhere, only gradations, as if the building had been designed to convince light to speak in a calm voice. On the carved reliefs that line certain approaches, the processions of tribute and greeting, the lamplight remakes the stone, deepening folds and sharpening edges for a few breaths before a wick's small sway smudges them again. So the figures seem steady in their forward gesture and yet newly alive in the play of shadow across a sleeve or a vessel's rim. Textiles absorb and discipline the light further. Heavy hangings subdue echoes and mark thresholds. Their woven patterns not loud enough to draw the eye from faces, but sufficient to soften the corners of space, while tablecloths and bench covers receive the lamp glow into their fibers, so the edges blur as if the fabric were drinking rather than reflecting. At every juncture, the staff's bearing reinforces the same principle: nothing rushed, nothing stalled. A cup is set down with both hands, fingertips released in a smooth withdrawal, so metal does not ring. A door is held until a waiting pair has taken 2 quiet steps past the threshold, then closed with a touch that replaces the hinge against stone rather than letting it find its seat with sound. The path of guests through the rooms is not announced aloud, but inscribed by posture. An attendant's open palm indicates this way without pointing. The turn of a shoulder offers the choice between a nearer or farther route, and the step backward that precedes a bow gives space for a senior figure to pass first. If there is confusion, it is smoothed by the building itself. The lesser doors are narrower and open to courts where the light is gentler and the ceilings lower, inviting people to pause and regroup, while the main door to the hall of dining broadens and brightens so that even an uncertain guest finds the center without thinking. The arrangement of seating is similarly legible. The place of the great king is signified not by height alone, but by a dense weave of signs, the richest carpet at his feet carrying a scent of cedar from the chest in which it was stored. The textiles behind him patterned in a way familiar from distant satrapies so that guests can read the empire's breadth in cloth. The lamps in this zone trimmed to a flame that is neither taller nor brighter than others, but whose reflectors are set at angles that bathe the royal table in a continuous, even glow. The places for the royal family align with this light in 2 shallow arcs, while the places for state and honored envoys extend in measured ranks along the long sides of the hall, each setting identical in function but varied in decoration: 1 cup of gold, 1 of gilded silver, 1 of worked bronze, so that rank is expressed as a progression of material while shape remains constant, a quiet grammar that makes hierarchy clear without turning it into spectacle. In such a room, sound is not silence but containment. The large volume catches voices and lowers them, polishing roughness away until the many languages combine into a single texture of speech. The first course arrives not as a sudden burst of activity, but as the next slow breath in the room's rhythm. For long minutes before the bread itself appears, you notice a faint change in the air, the clean, warm scent of baked wheat riding a current from the service passage, delicate enough at first to be almost imagined, then building until it becomes a steady thread among the hall's layered aromas of resin and lamp oil. When the attendants emerge, they move in even pairs, each carrying a shallow, wide basket draped with a linen cloth, the corners folded inward to keep the warmth close, the cloth itself slightly translucent in the lamplight, so the rounded shapes beneath are only half hidden. At each table, 1 attendant lifts a fold with a slow, practiced motion, allowing the heat to escape in a breath that carries the scent of fresh baking into the immediate space, the edges of the flatbreads catching the light where they have crisped to a pale gold. The centers still soft and slightly raised, marked here and there with darker spots where the dough had met hotter stone. Each guest is offered a piece directly into their hand or onto their small plate, the surface warm to the touch, the texture yielding yet with enough firmness to tear cleanly. There is a faint dusting of fine ground salt worked into the surface so subtly that it comes forward only after the first bite, a whisper of mineral sharpness beneath the round, comforting taste of grain. The servers move on without breaking their paired formation, the trailing edge of each cloth settling back over the remaining bread in a small, graceful collapse. When all have been served, there is a pause no one hurries to clear. No other dish arrives so the bread can be eaten slowly, accompanied only by the conversation's murmur and the soft shift of cushions. Then, as if on an unspoken cue, the second wave begins. Tall trays of fruit and nuts carried at shoulder height, the polished rims catching the light so they seem to float before the servers. Each tray is a map of the empire's reach clusters of deep purple grapes from the valleys near the Mediterranean coast, their skins taut and cool, pomegranates split to reveal the garnet gloss of seeds still nested in pale membranes. Figs from the southern orchards, their skins wrinkled, the flesh within holding the day's sun. Almonds in smooth shells from the highlands, walnuts with their ridged cases, pistachios pale against the polished wood of the bowls, dates from the deserts, dark and soft, almost sticky with natural sugar, set beside dried apricots the color of amber. The attendants name each fruit or nut in low tones to the nearest guest as they offer it, their voices carrying not just the name but the origin: a town, a riverbank, a province, so that each morsel becomes not only tastes but geography. The trays pass in measured arcs until all tables have been reached, then retreat in the same slow cadence. After another pause, the main course makes its entrance, not in a clatter of platters but in a stately procession. Large, shallow dishes of roasted lamb at one end of the hall, roasted beef at the other, each piece arranged so the browned, herb-scattered surface faces upward, the meat resting in its own juices with sprigs of rosemary, thyme, and a scattering of coriander seed lending a pattern as much visual as aromatic. The aroma is deep and layered smoke from the roasting fire, the brightness of herbs, the richness of the meat itself, and it moves ahead of the servers so that the scent reaches the table before the dish does. The lamb has been roasted whole and then cut into portions that preserve the curve of a rib or the round of a joint, each arranged to look complete rather than carved, the beef in thick slices showing the gradation from crisped edge to tender center. Alongside these, other attendants follow with side dishes, each one a contrast in color, texture or temperature. Bowls of lentils cooked until they are soft enough to yield at the first touch of a spoon, but still hold, their round shape flecked with caramelized onions whose sweetness has deepened to something close to spice. Shallow dishes of cucumbers sliced thin and mixed with thick, cool yogurt, the pale green and white bright against the darker table coverings, the chill of the dish a deliberate counter to the warmth of the meats and lentils. Everything is served in waves, the servers bending slightly to set each dish down with both hands, then stepping back in unison before moving to the next place, their departure as orderly as their arrival. The drinks follow in yet another wave, each type carried separately so that the visual and olfactory cues are distinct. Pitchers of pomegranate, wine with a deep ruby color that glows when the lamplight catches the surface in a poured arc, the scent tart and faintly floral. Jugs of barley beer, opaque and golden with a faint foam that settles quickly into stillness. Jars of honeyed water, pale and clear, the sweetness perceptible only in the air near the cup. The servers fill each vessel halfway, a gesture of generosity that leaves room for toasts and second pourings. As the guests begin to eat and drink, there is no rush, each course is allowed its own time. The flavors not layered over one another, but given space to fade before the next is offered. And through it all, the same refrain is true. Simple food, made splendid by the setting, eaten slowly in unison. The change from the act of dining to the unfolding of entertainment within the great king's hall happens with such an unhurried, almost imperceptible rhythm that one might miss the very first signal, if one were not in the habit of attending to the subtleties of a courtly night. There is no clang of gong or sharp clap to mark the moment, no sudden shift in the light, no dramatic announcement, only the faint, nearly subliminal entrance of sound into the thick air already scented with resin, warm bread, the trace of wine, and the underlying mineral coolness of the carved stone. It begins with a single note from a harp somewhere not at the center but toward one of the darker recesses of the hall, the kind of note that does not strike but rather emerges, as though it had been hiding in the lamplight's shadows, and has now decided to stretch and breathe. Its vibration hangs for a moment, the warmth of gut string mellowed by the soft resonance of wood that has absorbed years of similar evenings, and before it fades entirely, another note answers it, and then another, the sound building not by force but by accumulation, the way a thin drizzle on paving stones imperceptibly becomes a sheen of water. The harp's voice is deep yet uninsistent, each pluck followed by space enough for the listener to notice how the note changes as it dies, how the air in the hall seems to bend minutely around it. From somewhere just beyond the direct line of sight, perhaps, behind a carved column, joins a flute, its first tone so quiet it could be mistaken for a sigh, then resolving into a thin silver line of melody that curls around the harp's broader tones like smoke around a pillar. The flute's breath is steady, without vibrato or ornament, each note set at a length just long enough to leave a trace, but short enough not to dominate, a deliberate modesty that allows the mind to both follow it and drift. After a time, almost without notice, a drum makes itself known, though to call it a beat would be too strong. It is more the soft pressure of skin on skin, a muted thump that marks time, not for the body to move but for the mind to rest in regularity, the intervals between each touch so wide that the listener can forget they are counting until the next sound gently resets the sense of measure. The three instruments together create not a performance to be watched, but an environment to be inhabited, and in that softened space, conversation lowers itself instinctively, voices narrowing their range, hands moving more slowly toward cups and plates. It is in this lull that the court bard appears, not by stepping forward abruptly, but by being already present when one happens to look toward the center of the room. His robe is simple, the fabric of fine weave, but without bright dye, the hem worked with a narrow braid that catches lamplight when he moves. He does not clear his throat or raise a hand, only waits until the murmurs in the nearest rows have ebbed to a natural pause, before letting the first words fall into the shared air. His voice is low, but shaped to carry without strain, each syllable fully formed, as if he were setting stones along a path for others to tread at leisure. He begins with no names, no grand declarations, only a place and a time, offered gently. It was in the days when the river had not yet found the course, when the trees on its banks leaned far out as if to listen to the water's first attempts at speech. And from that point he moves with patience through a story known to many in the hall, a tale of a journey, a gift, and a lesson, one that holds no violence and no great turning point, but instead lingers on the spaces between events. The waiting at a ford, the taste of unfamiliar grain in a market, the cool of shade beneath a carved lintel. He names no victory, he describes no climax, only lets the details collect like quiet eddies, until the listener is less following a plot than dwelling in a moment whose edges blur with the present one. When he comes to the end, it is not marked as an ending so much as a return, his final phrase echoing the first, with only a slight turn of meaning, closing the circle without sealing it, leaving a gap for thought to slip through. He withdraws with the same absence of emphasis with which he arrived, his place taken again by space and by the sound of the harp, which resumes as if it had been merely resting. In the softened air that follows, small movements take on their own significance. At a table near the king's right, one envoy leans toward another, their shoulders almost touching, and into the space between their hands slides a narrow ring of worked silver, its surface marked with incised lines so fine they catch at a fingertip the weight in the palm. Almost nothing yet sufficient to declare its presence. The receiving envoy does not try it on but holds it enclosed in his fingers for a moment, then places it beside his cup, as if to let it rest in the lamplight. At another table, a folded square of cloth passes from one guest to another, the texture smooth and tightly woven, the color subdued, its scent faintly redolent of the cedar chest from which it came. There is no display, no unfolding. Such exchanges are private acknowledgments made visible only by proximity, not by announcement. In other corners of the hall, heads inclined toward each other, eyes lowered in the way that marks respect without deference so deep as to break equality. Younger officials keep their hands folded loosely on the table's edge when addressed by elders, their bodies turned slightly toward the speaker but not leaning forward, a balance between readiness and patience. Each gesture is measured, and between them lie pauses long enough to be filled only by the harp's quiet notes or the flute's unhurried curve. The drum's soft pulse remains a constant, not driving toward anything but keeping the night's slow heart steady. The atmosphere becomes one in which the boundaries between acts, music, story, exchange, conversation are porous, each seeping into the next without announcement, so that time feels less like a line than a pool, deepening in place. The musicians do not seek applause. The bard does not wait for acknowledgement. The givers of gifts do not watch for reactions. Each offers what they have into the shared space, and the space accepts, folds it into the weave, and continues. The hall's light remains steady, the scent of resin and bread and wine gently fading and returning as the servers pass with small jugs to replenish cups without comment. If there is any change in volume, it is downward the further into the night. The softer each sound becomes until the music is almost a memory of itself. The voices are little more than the shape of moving lips, and the passing of a silver ring or a square of woven cloth is less an act than a continuation of the evening's shared stillness. A stillness in which the Empire's many languages, customs, and histories meet not in competition or display, but in the quiet certainty that here, in this hall, all are temporarily bound by the same measured pace and the same acceptance of time as something to be inhabited, not hurried through. The close of the banquet does not come as a moment, as a bell rung or a declaration made, but as an ebbing, a slow and deliberate retreat of the evening's current until the tide of activity draws back into stillness, leaving its traces like the faint foam left on a shoreline. It begins almost imperceptibly, as though one lamp in a distant corner decides to burn a little lower, its light now less eager, its glow softening against the carved stone it touches, the air, which for hours has carried a woven pattern of sensely resinous thread of incense, the warm sweetness of honey, the ripeness of dates and figs. The faint pepper and cardamom from the last cups of spiced milk now begins to unravel, each note loosening, fading into the larger quiet, until they are sensed more in memory than in presence. Attendants have been moving the whole time, but their patterns change. No longer bearing trays with purpose toward the tables, they drift instead toward the peripheries, collecting empty dishes with both hands so that they do not clink, folding a table covering inward to contain the smallest crumbs, tilting the flame of an oil lamp so that it gutters only for a moment before settling into a lower, steadier burn. The last course has been served small bowls of fruits gathered from across the Empire, each carrying with it the landscape from which it came. Dates grown where river palms lift fronds against blinding light, figs, swelling in the heat of terraced gardens, honey cakes from highland apiaries where the air is thin and the flowers bloom in brief profusion. The figs have skins with a bloom so fine it dulls the lamplight to a muted sheen. The dates gleam darkly as though holding the last warmth of the day inside their flesh. The honey cakes carry a quiet weight in the hand, their grains still visible beneath the gloss of syrup. The spiced milk trembles faintly in its bronze cup, its surface so still it reflects the flame above in a softened circle. Guests do not rush to eat some, let their fingers rest along the cup's curve. Feeling the heat pass slowly into the skin, some break a cake in half and leave it on the plate for minutes before lifting a piece to the mouth, letting the honey dissolve without chewing. This is food for the end, taken not to fill but to anchor the last moments of the evening in something tangible. The music too has changed its form. The harp remains, but its player draws only one string at a time, letting the note lengthen into the space, until it meets the room's own silence and merges with it, each sound as much an absence as a presence. The flute offers only occasional phrases, perhaps a pair of notes that arc gently and then vanish, leaving behind a feeling like the memory of breath. The drum, if still touched, is so muted it is more a pressure felt through the floor than a sound in the air. The musicians themselves are half hidden now, as though the music comes from the hall's own walls, a lingering of the evening rather than an act being performed. Conversation has thinned as well, dropping into pockets of near whisper where words are as much for the speaker's own satisfaction as for the listener's understanding. There are smiles that do not need to be seen, only felt in the tone of a reply. There are nods given over cups that do not disturb the posture of rest. The first to rise do so without signaling. There is no scraping of chairs, no clearing of throats, only the soft adjustment of robes and the gentle turn of a body toward the outer walkways. They depart in pairs and trios, perhaps a single envoy walking alongside an attendant who guides them with a lamp. The outer air meets them as a cooler current, the scent of the torches mixing with the night's openness, the stone underfoot still faintly warm from the day but already cooling toward the midnight chill. Those who watch them go see their silhouettes blur against the terrace's edge, then dissolve entirely into the darker sweep of the plain. Inside, the hall expands into its own emptiness, the absence of bodies and voices making the space feel larger, more resonant. The light, though still present, has taken on a quieter quality, less ablaze, more a pulse, the shadows in the carved reliefs deeper now, the gold of the vessels subdued. The air feels different too, the collective warmth of so many guests replaced by the slower, more even temperature of stone and night air meeting. Cushions remain indented where people have sat. The cloths on the tables still creased where elbows rested, the smallest crumbs or seeds visible against the weave. Attendants moved through these remnants with a patience that mirrors the evening Essone pace, lifting a cup as though it might still hold weight, smoothing a fold as if the cloth might remember the gesture until it is next unfolded. The harp has gone silent entirely, and in its absence the quiet feels both wider and more intimate. The only sounds now are the low hiss of oil lamps, the occasional footstep, the faint brush of cloth. The scent of the feast still clings faintly, especially in the places where plates were set and where warm bread rested earlier in the evening. But already it is becoming part of the hall's own fabric, something that will linger faintly until the next gathering overlays it with new layers. In this pause, before the last lamps are dimmed, the mind is free to return to the thought that has hovered all evening, that the smoothness of such a night, the safety of these halls, the unbroken pattern of welcome and departure, rests on an unseen scaffolding, the readiness of the immortals, stationed far from this room but forming the boundary within which such peace can unfold. Their discipline, their constant watch, ensures that the king may hold his banquet without fear, that emissaries from distant satrapies can walk home along torchlit paths without looking over their shoulders, and behind them, beyond them, there is still the vision of Cyrus. The understanding that an empire's strength lies not only in the lands it claims, but in the weaving together of those lands into a fabric that can hold nights like this, where a guest can taste figs from 100 days' journey away, can hear a harp's note drawn from a province they may never visit, can sit in the hall of a king whose reach is measured, not just by conquest, but by the number of languages spoken here, in mutual respect. As the last guests step out, and the attendants make their final passes through the hall, the lamps nearest the door are lowered, their flames bowing until they vanish, leaving only the central light to glow in a small circle. Shadows reach further now, softening every edge, making the reliefs look less like records of procession and more like shapes drifting toward dream. The last sounds are the faint clink of metal as vessels are gathered, the whisper of cloth as it is folded, the quiet breathing of the fire as it settles into embers. And then, as the doors are drawn closed, the hall becomes a contained darkness, holding within it the memory of light, of music, of the slow sharing of food, of words exchanged and silences honored. Outside, the torches along the walkways mark the line of safe passage, a line that runs outward unseen but unbroken to the edges of the empire where the immortals stand just as they have since the days of Cyrus, keeping the stillness that allows the center to shine. It is this stillness, vast and steady, that remains in the mind as the night deepens, inviting the listener to step away from the bright heart of the banquet into the wider, quieter expanse beyond, and from there into the rest that waits at the end of all such gatherings.